Most people think of the Second World War as something that happened in clearly bounded moments. A declaration here, an invasion there, a battle with a definable beginning and end. But the truth is that the greatest catastrophes in human history often arrive not with fanfare, but with mist. They come in the half-light, in the space between sleep and waking, in the ordinary hours when ordinary people are still dreaming. And it was precisely in such a moment that one of history's most consequential military campaigns began, not with trumpets or drums, but with the slow creeping away of darkness across a landscape most of the world had never seen. Let me take you back to the Baltic borderlands on the threshold of June 1941. Picture, if you will, a vast expanse of northern Europe that few documentary narrations linger upon, a region of lakes so numerous they seemed almost to outnumber the land itself, of forests so deep and dense that they had sheltered peoples and languages for millennia, of marshes that shifted with the seasons and turned solid ground into something uncertain. It is dawn, the kind of dawn that comes very early in those latitudes, when the sun never truly dips below the horizon in summer, when twilight lingers for hours and the world exists in a state of perpetual pearl-grey softness. A mist hangs over the fields, not the heavy, choking fog of lower altitudes, but a thin, luminous veil that clings to the grass and seems to rise up from the earth itself, as though the land were exhaling. Somewhere far off, a bird calls. The marshes reflect the lightening sky. In the forests, where birch trees stand like pale sentries among the darker pines, nothing yet moves. The roads that wind through this landscape are crude by Western standards, many little more than dirt tracks that become rivers of mud when the rains come. The villages are sparse, built mostly of wood, with thatched roofs that have weathered centuries. Smoke does not yet rise from the chimneys. The people who live here are still asleep, or perhaps just waking, unaware that this ordinary morning is the last ordinary morning their world will know for a very long time. Here in this landscape, this vast, waterlogged, forested landscape that stretches from the Baltic Sea inland toward Russia's heartland, one of the war's most momentous campaigns is about to unfold. A campaign that would lead an entire German army group northeastward toward one of Europe's greatest cities. A campaign that would reshape the geography of suffering, that would trap millions in hunger and cold, that would test both the technological reach of modern warfare and the endurance of the human spirit against some of the harshest conditions nature and history could devise together. If you find yourself drawn to these deep histories, to the slow, grinding narratives of wartime that explore not just strategy and tactics, but the human experience beneath them, I'd invite you to subscribe. Here, we examine documentaries like this one about Army Group North and the drive toward Leningrad with all the care and depth it deserves, free from rush and full of the kind of carefully researched detail that reveals not just what happened, but how it felt to be there when it did. Now, let us move a little closer to that horizon. The light is growing stronger. It is 22 June 1941, though few in this borderland yet know it. The date exists, for now, only on the orders locked in the sealed envelopes of commanders who have been waiting for this moment. The mist has not yet burned away. There is still an hour, perhaps two, before the world changes, and in that suspended moment, in that strange, dreamlike interlude between peace and total war, let us consider what has brought us here. 3 months earlier, in Berlin, in a compound surrounded by pine forests, not unlike those we have just imagined, Adolf Hitler issued a directive. Operation Barbarossa, it was called, a vast invasion of the Soviet Union, one of the most ambitious military undertakings in European history. The plan was audacious in its scope. 3 massive army groups would advance simultaneously across the eastern frontier, each with a different strategic objective, each operating across a front of staggering width. To the south, Army Group South would drive toward Ukraine and the oil fields of the Caucasus. In the center, Army Group Center would advance toward Moscow itself, aimed at the very heart of Soviet power. And here, in the north, Army Group North would have perhaps the most difficult and least glamorous task of all: to advance through forests and marshes, across lakes and rivers, toward the city of Leningrad, formerly called St. Petersburg, perched on the Baltic coast where Russia met the sea. Most military historians note that this was the most ambitious invasion the world had ever seen. But what is sometimes overlooked is just how dependent this entire operation was on speed. Hitler and his generals believed, with a confidence that seems now almost incomprehensible, that the Soviet Union could be defeated in a matter of months. A quick, violent blow, they theorized, would shatter Soviet military capacity before autumn. By winter, German troops would be garrisoning conquered territory, and the war would be essentially won. It was a calculation based on underestimating both Soviet resilience and the sheer vastness of the Russian land. But at this moment, with the mist still clinging to the fields, and the sun just beginning to touch the horizon, those doubts had not yet surfaced. The night is still settling. Can you imagine the tension of those waiting hours, the soldiers of Army Group North, positioned just beyond the frontier, knowing that within hours they would be ordered to cross a line they could not return from? Many of them were young men, some barely older than boys, conscripted into service, or enlisted in the fervor of Nazi ideology, or simply caught in the machinery of a state mobilized for total war. They were positioned along the Neman River and across the frontier with Lithuania, in dugouts and foxholes, behind rivers and in forests, waiting. They had been told they were about to liberate Europe from Bolshevism. They had been told the victory would be swift. They had been told many things. And now they waited for dawn. Let us turn our attention to the man who would command this vast operation across the Baltic wastes. Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb, a title that sounds almost medieval now, and indeed his bearing and manner carried something of an older Prussian tradition. He was 67 years old, which made him ancient by the standards of modern warfare, an officer who had trained in the last decades of the 19th century, who had seen the trench horrors of the First World War and survived them. Some historians suggest he was troubled by what he had been ordered to do. Others maintain that he was a thorough professional who executed his orders without question. The truth, as so often in history, likely lay somewhere in between. He was appointed to command Army Group North not long before the invasion, and he accepted the role with the discipline of a career officer. What he thought in his private moments, no one truly knows. Under his command were two field armies: the 16th Army, under General Adolf Strauss, a career officer of conventional competence, and the 18th Army, commanded by General Georg Lindemann, who had the distinction of being one of the few senior commanders in the Wehrmacht, with significant experience in earlier campaigns in the East. These armies would provide the grinding, methodical advance through difficult terrain, but to punch through quickly, to create what the Germans called a Durchbruch, a breakthrough. Army Group North also had attached to it Panzer Group 4, under the command of Colonel General Erich Hoepner. Panzer forces were the cutting edge of German warfare in 1941, fast-moving, mechanized, capable of covering vast distances in days rather than weeks. Hoepner was an aggressive commander, ambitious and eager to demonstrate the superiority of German armor. Under him served multiple panzer divisions, equipped with the Panzer III and IV tanks, machines that the Soviet Union had nothing to match in those early days of the war. The composition of Army Group North, spread across these commands, amounted to somewhere in the region of 800,000 men, a vast human force, equipped with artillery, vehicles, anti-tank guns, and all the machinery of a modern military. Yet against the distances they would have to travel, against the terrain that now lay misty and quiet before them, 800,000 men would prove insufficient. 800,000 men would prove not quite enough to accomplish what had been asked of them, but they did not yet know that. The mist has begun to thin now, the light is stronger. In perhaps an hour, perhaps two, the invasion would begin. Artillery would shatter the quiet of this peaceful dawn. The carefully laid German columns would begin to move. Tanks would cross the frontier. Soldiers would kill and die. Refugees would begin their flight. Cities would burn, and the long, agonizing drive toward the frozen city on the Baltic would commence. a campaign that would test these armies to their limits and beyond, that would reveal both the terrifying capability of mechanized warfare and the resilience of a people defending their homeland. But for now, still, there is the mist, there is still the quiet, there is still that strange, suspended moment before history lurches forward. Let us sit with that stillness for a moment longer, because once it is broken, it will not return. And as we drift deeper into this particular morning, into the mist and the vast quietness of that border, you might find yourself drawn to ask, what does it mean to trace a military campaign not as a sequence of victories and defeats, but as a human journey through a landscape that was about to be forever altered? If you find yourself returning to these questions, if you discover that you want to travel with us through other corridors of the Second World War, through moments of strategy and sacrifice, through the voices of soldiers and civilians whose lives were caught in currents far beyond their control, then you may wish to subscribe to this channel. We create documentaries that move at the pace of reflection rather than spectacle, that invite you to sit with history rather than race through it, and that treat the great events of the war years as narratives meant to be inhabited, deeply and carefully. Each new film we release unfolds in this same unhurried manner, in this same tone of quiet examination, so that you can let your mind rest even as it learns. You can subscribe, knowing that we will return to these territories again and again, to Operation Barbarossa in all its dimensions, to the campaigns in the East and the West, to the stories both monumental and intimate that shaped those years. And now, let us settle back into our particular path, into the Baltic sunrise, into the moment when Adolf Hitler's grand strategy for the conquest of the Soviet Union was about to be set in motion. The decision had already been made, far away in Berlin, in the rooms where maps were unfolded, and generals debated how the vast territories to the east might be carved up, divided, and subdued. But here, in the quiet of the dawn, along the borders of Lithuania and Latvia, along the rivers that had for centuries defined the margin between Germanic Europe and the Slavic lands beyond, the soldiers did not yet know what was coming. They stood in the mist, they waited. And in a few hours, everything would change. In the spring of 1941, as the German military establishment finalized plans for what would become the largest invasion in human history, a fundamental strategic vision shaped every decision about how the assault on the Soviet Union would unfold. Hitler and his generals conceived of Operation Barbarossa not as a single, unified thrust toward Moscow, but rather as a coordinated advance along three distinct geographical axes, each carrying its own strategic weight and objective. This three-pronged design reflected both the vast distances involved and the belief among German planners that the Soviet state could be fragmented and defeated through simultaneous pressure from multiple directions. The southern thrust, Army Group South under Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, would drive through Ukraine toward the oil fields of the Caucasus and the economic heartland of Soviet territory. The Central Force, Army Group Center commanded by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, would follow the most direct route toward Moscow itself, the symbolic and administrative heart of Soviet power. And in the north, Army Group North, under Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb, would undertake a campaign that in some ways was considered the most specialized and, strategically, the most politically fraught of the three. The assignment given to Army Group North carried particular significance in Nazi ideology and long-term strategic thinking. While Moscow represented political authority and Army Group Center's drive offered the most immediate prestige, the Baltic region and the approach to Leningrad held meanings that extended beyond conventional military geography. Leningrad was not merely another Soviet city, it was the birthplace of Bolshevism, the former capital of the Russian Empire under its newer name, and a symbol of Soviet communism that Hitler regarded with particular ideological intensity. The conquest of the Baltic states themselves, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, represented territory that had once belonged to the Russian Empire and that Nazi ideology viewed as part of a broader racial and geopolitical reorganization of Eastern Europe. Moreover, Controlling the Baltic coastline would deny the Soviet Navy access to vital sea routes and would secure German supply lines extending northward. There was also, as historians have often noted, an almost mystical quality to Nazi thinking about Leningrad. Destroying it, or at minimum reducing it to irrelevance, seemed to hold a symbolic importance that transcended pure military calculation. What role, then, did Army Group North play in the overall strategic architecture of Barbarossa? The answer is layered and somewhat paradoxical. On the surface, Army Group North was tasked with the most limited geographical objective of the three army groups. Its northernmost boundary meant that it would not advance as far east as either Army Group Center or Army Group South. It would not threaten Moscow directly. Its armies would operate through terrain that was markedly different from the open steppes further south, more forested, more waterlogged, dotted with extensive lakes and marshes that would impede rapid movement. In this sense, Army Group North was given what might appear to be a secondary mission: secure the Baltic, eliminate Soviet forces in the northwestern theater, and establish a secure northern flank for the broader German advance. The logistical planners assigned it fewer panzer divisions and fewer resources overall compared to the central and southern thrusts, reflecting this apparent secondary status. Yet at the same time, the strategic importance of cutting off Leningrad was regarded as absolutely essential to the overall success of Barbarossa. German planners believed that if Leningrad could be isolated and neutralized early in the campaign, it would accomplish several critical objectives simultaneously. It would prevent the Soviet Union from organizing any coordinated defense from the Baltic region. It would secure the northern flank against any potential Soviet counteroffensive or intervention from Scandinavia. It would deny Soviet forces a major base of operations and industrial production. And perhaps most significantly, it would psychologically signal to the world that Nazi Germany could rapidly achieve decisive victories even against the vast Soviet state. The speed with which Army Group North was expected to reach Leningrad thus became a crucial test of whether the entire Barbarossa operation was succeeding according to plan. If Army Group North bogged down or failed to achieve rapid progress, it would raise questions about the viability of the entire invasion. If it succeeded brilliantly, it would demonstrate German military superiority and the correctness of Hitler's strategic vision. The relationship between the three army groups involved a delicate balance of coordination and competition. Army Group Center's drive on Moscow was clearly conceived as the decisive thrust, the main effort that would break Soviet resistance and force capitulation. But this concentration of effort in the center meant that Army Group North and Army Group South would have to accomplish their missions with relatively fewer resources while maintaining operational contact with the central advance. Army Group North's northern flank would eventually be exposed as Army Group Center advanced eastward, creating a widening gap that German planners hoped would not become a source of vulnerability. The coordination of timing became crucial. If any one of the three army groups fell significantly behind schedule, it could undermine the entire operation. Conversely, if all three advanced at the planned pace, German strategists believed the Soviet military could not effectively concentrate its forces to resist all three thrusts simultaneously. The Soviets would be forced to choose which threat to prioritize, and whatever choice they made, one or more German army groups would be able to achieve a decisive breakthrough. The economic and territorial logic underlying this three-pronged approach also reflected Nazi ideology regarding the future organization of conquered Eastern territory. The Baltic states were viewed as part of a broader racial reorganization that would accompany military conquest. The agricultural regions of Ukraine were essential for feeding the German population and supporting the long-term Nazi vision of a continental European economy dominated by Berlin. And the destruction of Leningrad, or at minimum its isolation and reduction to impotence, was seen as essential to eliminating the geographical centers of Soviet power and ideology. In this sense, the three-pronged invasion was not merely a military operation, but a comprehensive attempt at continental reorganization under Nazi auspices. Army Group North's role in this larger schema was specific but profound. It was tasked with securing, controlling, and fundamentally transforming a crucial region while simultaneously maintaining the operational security of the entire northern flank. How successfully it accomplished these overlapping objectives would in many ways determine not merely the fate of the Soviet Union in 1941, but the trajectory of the entire war itself, or so German planners believed, as the spring turned to early summer and the vast invasion force prepared to cross into Soviet territory. At the head of this vast machinery stood Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb, a man of the old Prussian military tradition, whose career stretched back across wars and decades. Von Lieb was 66 years old when he assumed command of Army Group North in the spring of 1941, a careful strategist with a reputation for methodical planning rather than the improvised boldness that characterized some of his peers. He had served in the First World War, risen through the Weimar period, and maintained a certain distance from the Nazi Party itself, though like so many senior officers, he found himself now commanding one of the largest military forces ever assembled. There was perhaps an irony in this, a man of measured temperament placed at the head of what was meant to be a lightning campaign, a blitzkrieg designed to complete itself in months before the snows came. Beneath von Lieb's authority lay a structure of extraordinary complexity and concentrated firepower. The 16th Army, commanded by General Ernst Busch, formed the left wing of the advance, charged with pressing northward through Lithuania and toward the Baltic coast. Busch was a capable officer, methodical in his own right, tasked with the slower, grinding work of infantry advance and occupation. To his right stood the 18th Army under General Georg Lindemann, a formation that would drive through the heartland of Lithuania and Latvia, keeping pace with Busch while maintaining pressure toward the northeast. These two armies, millions of men spread across hundreds of kilometers, represented the broad hammer of the invasion, the steady weight that would push forward through villages and forests, across rivers and defensive lines that the Soviets had barely begun to prepare. But the true cutting edge of Army Group North was Panzer Group 4, commanded by Colonel General Erich Hoepner. Of all the senior commanders in the German army, Hoepner was among the most intellectually gifted and militarily incisive, a tank commander of exceptional skill who understood the mechanics of rapid, deep penetration. Panzer Group 4 was not an army in the traditional sense, but rather a specialized formation designed to punch through enemy lines with speed and violence, to disrupt command structures, capture intact bridges and crossings, and race toward objectives far behind the front. It was composed of 3 panzer divisions and 3 motorized divisions, along with supporting armor and reconnaissance units, perhaps 200,000 men with thousands of vehicles that could move at speeds that the infantry could never match. Where could such a force go? That was the question that animated every German planner's imagination in those early weeks. Hoepner himself was an unusual figure in the Nazi military hierarchy. He was no enthusiast for National Socialism. Indeed, he harbored doubts about the regime and the nature of the campaign he had been ordered to undertake. Yet he was a consummate professional, a man who understood that his duty lay in executing his orders with maximum skill and efficiency. He possessed an almost intuitive grasp of terrain and movement, the ability to read a map and landscape, and understand not merely where an army could go, but where it should go to achieve the greatest effect. Under his command, Panzer Group 4 would become the instrument of spectacular advances, covering distances in days that previous campaigns might have taken weeks to accomplish. These 3 formations, the 2 field armies and the Panzer Group, were not the whole of Army Group North's composition. Supporting them were thousands of transport vehicles, artillery batteries of remarkable density, engineer companies tasked with bridging rivers and clearing obstacles, signal units maintaining communication across vast distances, medical personnel struggling with the volume of wounded, supply lines stretching back hundreds of kilometers toward the Reich. There were also specialized units attached to the Army Group, units whose purpose was less visible but no less significant, though we might pause here and simply observe their existence without detail. The men who comprised these forces were diverse in their origins and motivations. Many were career soldiers, products of the old Prussian tradition or the interwar Reichswehr. Many others were conscripts, drawn from German cities and farms and factories, trained hastily and equipped with weapons they had barely learned to use. Some were ideologically committed to the Nazi cause, believing themselves to be on a civilizing mission in the East. Others served out of obligation or fear, performing their duties without conviction. The vast majority, perhaps, simply did what soldiers do in any war. They followed orders, maintained discipline, looked after their comrades, and tried to survive the experience. As for how they understood the campaign before them, what they expected or feared or hoped for, these thoughts remained largely private, confined to letters not yet written and conversations not yet had. What unified all these disparate elements was the fundamental design of Army Group North's mission: to drive north and east with maximum speed, to break through whatever Soviet defensive lines existed in the Baltic region, to capture the city of Leningrad and the surrounding territories, and to link up, if possible, with Finnish forces attacking from the north. This was the grand strategic conception that sat behind every order, every march, every preparation made in those final days before the invasion began. Could it succeed? The planners certainly believed so, or at least they acted as though they did. The question of whether belief and reality would align was something that only time and experience could answer, and that answer would come swiftly, with a speed that even the swift-moving panzer columns would find startling. The land itself, though, held secrets that no amount of military planning could entirely overcome. The Baltic states and the northwestern approaches to Russia formed a landscape almost deliberately hostile to the movement of armies, a patchwork of terrain so fragmented, so tangled with water and forest, that mechanized war would find itself constantly negotiating with geography rather than simply conquering it. Imagine, if you will, the vast stretches of Lithuania and Latvia in those early summer months. The earth rises and falls in gentle undulations, rarely dramatic, but persistent enough to break an army's stride. Dense forests of spruce and birch close in from all sides, their canopies so thick that in places a soldier might lose the sun entirely, navigating instead by compass and the narrow paths that locals had worn over centuries. These were not the forests of Western Europe, ordered, managed, with clearings for agriculture. These were older forests, wilder somehow, full of hidden hollows and sudden defiles where a mechanized column could find itself bottled up or forced to halt while engineers cleared a passage. Between the forests lay the water. Countless lakes stippled the landscape like dropped coins on a vast green table, some large enough to be genuine obstacles, others smaller but no less frustrating to the pace of advance. The Galata, the Tilja, the Dubisa, the Nevelis, and dozens more, whose names would mean nothing to the German soldiers, but whose banks would cost them hours, sometimes days. Each lake required either a detour or an engineer's attention, and detours meant losing time, losing momentum, the very commodity that panzer commanders craved above all else. But perhaps more significant than the lakes were the marshes. This was the true impediment, the landscape's quiet resistance. Vast stretches of bog and marsh spread across the lowlands like sponges, some seasonal, fed by the spring thaw and summer rains, others permanent features that had shaped the region for millennia. The Šiauliai marshes, the great wetlands around the Dubisa Valley, and further north the Galie swamps, created zones of near impassability for vehicles. Tanks could sometimes force their way through with enormous effort, but supply columns, the endless trains of trucks carrying fuel, ammunition, food, faced genuine paralysis in the wetter seasons. A panzer division without supplies is simply a line of immobilized steel. The roads themselves were the final limiting factor, and perhaps the most frustrating for commanders accustomed to the relatively developed infrastructure of Central and Western Europe. The main thoroughfares connecting the major population centers, the routes through Kaunas, Vilnius, and toward Riga, were reasonably serviceable by the standards of the 1940s, but they were few in number and often narrow. Secondary roads quickly degraded from gravel to churned mud when heavy traffic passed over them, particularly during the wetter months. A single panzer column of a few hundred vehicles could render a road impassable within hours. And if the weather turned, if rain fell hard and sudden, as it often did in the Baltic spring and early summer, those same roads could become ribbons of mud that swallowed vehicles whole. One might ask, how then did the Germans imagine they could move an entire army group northward at speed? The answer lay partly in ruthlessness and partly in optimism. They planned to use the few main roads as arterial routes, gambling that their initial speed would be so overwhelming that they could capture bridges and key points before the Soviet defenders had time to organize. They would bypass resistance rather than assault it, leave pockets of trapped Soviet forces for follow-on infantry while the panzers pressed ahead. The entire strategy depended on speed, on achieving such velocity that the landscape's natural impediments would matter less than the paralysis of an enemy reeling from surprise. The Niemen River, the Dubisa, the Nevalis, the Daugava further north, and eventually the Dvina and the Luga, these waterways were meant to be mere interruptions in the advance, not walls. German engineers were equipped to bridge them, or to find fords, or in desperate circumstances, to simply wade through shallow sections, vehicles at risk, but momentum preserved. The forests would be bypassed when possible, only entered when roads cut through them and the advance required it. What none of this calculus truly accounted for, though, and this may have been the fatal assumption, was the way that geography could transform from inconvenience to strategic advantage once a mobile defense began to congeal. A forest that slowed the first wave of German panzers could, within days, become a strongpoint where Soviet defenders rallied and dug in. A marsh that seemed merely a nuisance in June could become impassable mud in July when the summer rains arrived with sudden violence. The landscape was not simply terrain to be crossed. It was a participant in the drama about to unfold, one that would grant advantages first to the attacker, then slowly, subtly, to the defender. The narrowness of the operational space, the way the Baltic campaign would be funneled along relatively few routes northward, meant that there was no room for maneuver in the grand sense. In the Ukraine or southern Russia, armies could sweep wide and encircle enemies. Here, the space was tighter. Armies would be forced to advance largely along parallel routes, each competing for the same choked roads, each impeding the other's progress as much as the enemy did. It was a recipe for congestion, for bottlenecks, for the kind of grinding operational friction that mathematics and planning could never fully eliminate. As the first light of dawn began to break over those forests and marshes on the morning of 22 June 1941, the landscape itself was poised to become as much an antagonist as the Red Army. The Germans did not yet understand this. Their soldiers, climbing into their vehicles in the pre-dawn darkness, had no sense of how the terrain would slowly, methodically, work against them. For now, there was only the weight of orders, the hum of engines starting, the smell of diesel fuel and anticipation. The land waited, patient and ancient, ready to teach harsh lessons to an army that had come to believe speed and steel could overcome all obstacles. The morning of June 22nd broke grey, and still, across the Lithuanian frontier. At precisely 3:15 in the morning, the summer darkness that hung so lightly at that latitude began to fracture. And in that moment of fracture, before the sun could properly rise, the Luftwaffe came first, as it always did. Wave upon wave of German bombers and fighters swept across the border, targeting Soviet airfields, supply depots, railway junctions. The noise must have been extraordinary. Imagine lying in a garrison dormitory in a small Soviet fort near the Neman River, the sudden percussion of anti-aircraft fire, the deeper thunder of explosions in the distance, growing closer. Many Soviet pilots never even reached their aircraft that morning. They ran from barracks into an inferno of their own airfield burning behind them. On the ground, the waiting was over. The artillery barrage began moments after the air assault, waves of German guns positioned along the frontier, their shells reaching across the narrow Niemen River to pound the Soviet defenses on the far bank. The Nemen itself was not particularly wide, perhaps 200 meters in most places, shallow in summer, fringed with reed beds and small islands that would prove tactically significant in the hours to come. The Soviet forces stationed here, part of the Red Army's Baltic military district, had been put on high alert only days before, yet there was still an almost surreal quality to the suddenness of it. Supplies were not fully forward, communications were still settling into place. The forward divisions simply had not finished their preparations for what they somehow knew was coming. What might the experience have felt like, standing at dawn in a Soviet trench as the Nemen mist began to clear, and you saw, for the first time, German assault boats crossing the river? The first German infantry units began their river crossing in the earliest morning light, using rubber boats and pontoons that the engineers had quietly positioned during the night. The crossing was methodical and, in those first moments, almost unopposed. The Soviet forward defenses, caught between the surprise of the assault and the intensity of the preliminary bombardment, were not able to mount an effective coordinated response. There was chaos in the chain of command. Orders were unclear. Some units fought with great determination and died in their positions. Others broke under the sheer weight of the assault, and still others, separated from their commanders, simply retreated or surrendered. By mid-morning, German assault troops had secured a bridgehead on the Soviet side of the Nemen. Engineer units followed, laying down pontoon bridges to allow the heavier vehicles and the waiting armor to cross. The Panzer Group 4 under General Erich Hoepner was poised and eager. Hoepner was one of the more politically aware of the senior German commanders, a man who would later turn against Hitler, but in June of 1941, he was a professional soldier in the grip of what seemed, to many German officers, like an unstoppable momentum. The tanks began to roll across the newly constructed bridges in the mid-morning light. Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks, their engines growling, their tracks throwing up dust on the newly conquered Soviet soil. It was a sight calculated to overwhelm the senses, and in many ways, calculated to overwhelm Soviet resistance. The collapse of the Soviet border defenses in this sector was remarkably swift. One might ask, how could a professional army, even caught by surprise, unravel so completely in such a short time? Part of the answer lay in the sheer weight of the German assault. Part of it lay in the numerical superiority that the Germans had achieved in this sector. Part of it lay in German tactical skill, the coordination of air power and artillery and ground forces operating in concert. But part of it, too, lay in the chaos of the Soviet command structure itself. Stalin's purges of the late 1930s had devastated the officer corps. Many of the most experienced senior commanders were dead, executed or imprisoned. The chain of command was brittle, information moved slowly. And worst of all, many commanders were paralyzed by fear of making wrong decisions in a political system that had taught them that wrong decisions could be fatal. By the afternoon of the first day, German forces had already advanced more than 20 kilometers beyond the Nemen. The speed was remarkable. Soviet counterattacks were hastily organized and largely ineffective. The few tanks that the Soviets could bring up to the front, scattered across a vast frontier with inadequate reserves, were defeated in brief, one-sided engagements. The German soldiers themselves, after months of preparation and training, were operating with an almost practiced efficiency. They had trained for this. They had studied maps of Soviet territory. They had prepared their supply lines and their assault routes. And now, in the early hours and days of the campaign, everything was working according to plan. It must have felt almost dreamlike to many of the German troops, the sensation that their months of preparation and waiting were paying off in this almost effortless advance. By the evening of the first day, Soviet forces along most of the frontier had been overwhelmed or driven into retreat. Prisoners were being taken in significant numbers, confused and often traumatized men, many of them conscripts who had only recently been drafted into the Red Army. The German forces were driving deeper into Soviet territory, following roads that became increasingly primitive, pushing through forests and across meadows where the resistance was sporadic and uncoordinated. The weather held. The roads, such as they were, remained passable. The logistical system, stretched but functioning, kept up with the advancing troops. It was a moment of triumph for the German military, though few could have foreseen, in that flush of early success, the long grinding tragedy that lay ahead. The swift collapse of Soviet border defenses in the opening hours of June 22nd would prove to be almost deceptive in its ease. It suggested a quick victory, a campaign measured in weeks rather than years. And yet, even as German forces were driving forward with that sense of inevitable triumph, the deeper resistance was only beginning to organize itself. What becomes immediately clear in those first hours of movement is that the Soviet forces arrayed along the border, despite their numbers, were caught in a state of profound unpreparedness. The panzer divisions of Hoepner's 4th Panzer Group, having achieved surprise and local air superiority through the Luftwaffe's opening strikes, pressed forward with an intensity that seemed to overwhelm any attempt at Soviet coordination. The roads northwestward through Lithuania, such as they were, became funnels for German steel and momentum. Kaunas, that ancient citadel where the Neman River bends and the landscape softens into marshland, fell within days. The Soviet garrison there, never fully reinforced, found themselves surrounded and cut off from retreat routes before they could establish any coherent defensive line. It was less a battle, in the traditional sense, than a swift cascading collapse. The movement northward quickened. Tank columns rolled through Lithuanian villages, where resistance appeared only sporadically, some Red Army units fighting with considerable bravery and tactical skill, holding terrain long enough to slow the German advance by hours, or perhaps a day, before being overrun or forced to break westward into forests and marshes to attempt escape. Yet these were fragments, isolated pockets. The larger Soviet command structure, that great apparatus, designed to command millions of soldiers, seemed paralyzed by the speed of events and the absence of clear orders flowing from Moscow. What had been a frontier became a rushing river of retreat. And then the advance reached Latvia. The road to Riga, that Baltic capital with its red-tiled rooftops and mercantile history, stretched forward through rolling countryside dotted with birch and pine forests. The Dvina River, which flows westward into the Gulf of Riga and the Baltic Sea itself, presented the first natural obstacle of any significance. Yet the German panzer columns, moving with the kind of mechanical coordination that such formations could achieve when supply lines held and resistance crumbled, managed to outflank Soviet positions and threatened to envelop the Soviet forces defending the river before those forces could establish any sort of coordinated withdrawal. Have you ever considered what it must have felt like for a Soviet commander in those early weeks, receiving conflicting orders from the rear, watching his reserves disappear into what seemed an endless tide of German vehicles and armor, knowing that the tactical situation he understood from maps bore little resemblance to the catastrophe unfolding around him? Riga fell in the first week of July, less than 3 weeks after the invasion had begun. The city itself was captured with remarkable speed. The Wehrmacht had learned, through campaigns in France and the Balkans, how to move motorized columns deep into enemy territory at a pace that disrupted all conventional defense. The psychological effect, it seems, was profound. Soviet soldiers who had been assured of the strength of their defenses found those defenses evaporating beneath the wheels of advancing panzers. The radio communications that should have coordinated withdrawal and reinforcement often carried nothing but silence or contradictory orders. Entire units found themselves cut off, their commanders forced to choose between surrender, dispersal into the forests and marshes to attempt a long trek eastward, or small unit ambushes against overwhelming odds. What is striking about this period, when one reads the accounts of German officers and men who participated in the advance, is how almost mechanical it all seemed to them. The Soviet forces they encountered were not organized into coherent defensive lines, but rather appeared in scattered groups, sometimes competent and aggressive, more often simply trying to escape the encirclement that kept threatening to close around them. The roads and rail lines that connected the Baltic states to the rest of the Soviet Union became clogged with retreating columns. Soldiers on foot, wounded carried in whatever vehicles could be spared, supplies being abandoned to the roadside when they could not be evacuated quickly enough. It was the texture of an army in deep disarray, of a command structure struggling to adapt to warfare at a speed it had not anticipated and for which its doctrines and procedures seemed inadequate. By mid-July, Army Group North had secured the Baltic coast. The panzer columns had driven so far and so fast that the infantry divisions following behind them, though moving at forced march pace themselves, could barely keep up. Supply lines stretched back hundreds of kilometers, and yet the Soviets seemed unable to mount any serious counterattack to cut these lines, to slow the momentum, to create even a temporary sanctuary where their forces could rally and reorganize. The roads through Latvia and Lithuania lay behind the advancing German spearheads, like a trail of conquered territory, and the psychological effect on the retreating Soviet forces must have been staggering. Is it possible that in those weeks of rapid movement and disorientation, the Soviets lost not merely territory, but something more profound, a sense that the defense was coherent, organized, and ultimately likely to prevail? The question, as the summer of 1941 wore on, was whether this momentum could be maintained. The panzer divisions had achieved what seemed almost miraculous, the near-total disruption of Soviet command and control in an entire region. But panzer divisions, for all their mobility and firepower, require fuel, ammunition, and replacement vehicles. They require rest for their crews. The infantry divisions needed to consolidate captured territory, to establish lines of communication, to prevent the formation of new Soviet forces in the rear. The landscape itself, as one moved northward and eastward away from the Baltic coast, began to change. The lakes became larger and more frequent. The forests grew denser. The roads, never abundant in the Soviet Union, became fewer and worse. A campaign that had been one of movement and breakthrough would, within weeks, begin to transform into something far less predictable and far more grinding. Yet beneath the thunder of the Wehrmacht's forward columns, threading through the dust of their advance, moved another story altogether, one far quieter, far more intricate, and in many ways far more fragile than the military tides of conquest and retreat. The Baltic lands through which the panzers rolled were not empty stages waiting for armies to perform upon them. They were home. They held people with names, with histories reaching back centuries, with languages and customs that had survived countless shifts of power across that restless corner of Europe. And as Army Group North pushed northward in those first weeks of summer, these populations found themselves caught in a moment that would reshape everything they knew about home. The Baltics in 1941 were a tapestry of extraordinary diversity. Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia each carried their own distinct character, their own traditions and grievances and hopes. What they shared, perhaps more than anything else, was a kind of recent freedom, a breathing space that had lasted little more than 2 decades. These lands had thrown off Russian imperial rule only after the First World War, and for roughly 20 years they had existed as independent nations, republics that struggled and progressed and made their own ways in a troubled Europe. Then came 1940, when the Soviet Union, moving under its agreement with Nazi Germany, annexed them silently and firmly. Tanks rolled in. The Soviet flag was raised. A year later, the Germans came. For many in the Baltic populations, particularly those who had suffered under Russian domination before the independence years, the Germans arrived not as conquerors, but as liberators. This is a delicate historical truth, one that carries within it contradictions and dangers, but it is true nonetheless. Weeks and months of Soviet occupation had been harsh. Deportations had been carried out. The secret police had moved through towns and villages. And now, as the Wehrmacht appeared on the roads, there were Lithuanians, Latvians, and Estonians who genuinely believed that perhaps, under German rule, they might regain something of what they had lost. Some collaborated openly. Some even took up arms, joining auxiliary units that marched alongside the German forces. Can you imagine the confusion of such a moment? The hunger for national dignity mixing with the arrival of a new occupier, the hope that one regime might be preferable to another. Yet complexity did not stop there. For other populations in the Baltic lands, particularly the Jewish communities of Lithuania and Latvia, communities with deep roots stretching back centuries, the German advance brought no liberation whatsoever. It brought instead a growing dread. The stories were already circulating, the rumors from Poland and other territories the Germans had occupied. And as the Wehrmacht moved forward, so too did the killing units, the Einsatzgruppen, the special commandos whose purpose was systematic murder. In Kaunas, in Riga, in smaller towns throughout the region, the Jewish populations faced not occupation, but annihilation. Within weeks of the German advance, mass shootings had begun. Entire communities that had endured pogroms and persecution and survived for centuries were being wiped away in days. The civilian experience of the German advance itself was profoundly unsettling in more ordinary ways as well. Roads were choked with refugees, both those fleeing the Germans and those, particularly ethnic Germans living in the Baltic states, fleeing the Soviets or moving toward the German advance hoping for better circumstances. Villages were requisitioned for supplies and quarters. Young men, whether they collaborated or not, could be conscripted into various auxiliary forces or simply taken for labor. Farms were seized. Livestock disappeared. The machinery of war, moving at such speed and with such weight, ground through the ordinary rhythms of civilian life, as though those rhythms barely mattered. And yet, because the German advance was so swift, because the panzer columns moved ahead so rapidly, there was, for many civilians, a strange kind of respite in those early weeks. The SS units and the apparatus of terror came behind the armies. The immediate experience of occupation, for many ordinary people in towns and villages not directly in the path of combat, was chaotic and frightening and full of strange new rules, but not immediately apocalyptic. There was often time to hide things that mattered, to dig holes in gardens and bury family photographs and treasured possessions, hoping somehow that survival itself might be possible if one could remain quiet and unnoticed. This, too, is part of what it meant to live through the arrival of the Wehrmacht in the Baltic summer of 1941, a paradox of terror and suspended terror, of hope and desperation, intertwined in ways that would have been almost incomprehensible to those living through quieter times. The arrival of the Germans also disrupted the fundamental patterns of exile and flight. Soviet officials, party members, secret police, those who had orchestrated the annexation and occupation of the previous year, now needed to flee, moving eastward ahead of the German advance or falling into captivity. This evacuation was often hurried and brutal. Many civilians were forced to travel eastward with the retreating Soviets, cramped into freight trains heading toward territories still controlled by Moscow. For them, the question was almost equally agonizing. Was it better to remain under the Germans or to flee into the unknown interior of the Soviet Union? Some families were separated in the chaos. Some made choices that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. For the Estonians and Latvians and Lithuanians who did remain, or who had not yet fled, the experience of the occupation that began to take shape over the summer months was one of increasing constraint and surveillance. German military government was imposed, curfews were established, work orders were issued, ration cards were distributed. The infrastructure of control and governance, which had already begun under the Soviets, was now reimposed under German administration. And for those who had believed that German occupation might somehow be less oppressive than Soviet rule, the reality began to settle in with a kind of grey, suffocating weight. Every occupier, whatever the language they spoke or the ideology they professed, was still an occupier. Freedom, it became clear, was not something that could be gained by hoping one foreign master might be preferable to another. Yet there was also, particularly in the first weeks, a strange kind of cultural and social activity that continued in pockets. In some towns, theatres remained open for limited performances. In some places, newspapers published, albeit under German censorship. Cafes served food and drink. though menus were thin and prices were steep. Life did not simply stop. It bent and twisted under the pressure of occupation, but people continued to exist, to find small moments of normalcy, to see friends and family when they could. The human capacity to persist, to maintain something like routine and connection, even in the midst of upheaval, is a remarkable and sorrowful thing to observe across the span of history. It speaks to resilience, yes, but also to a kind of denial that is sometimes necessary for survival, a willingness to pretend that today might be better than yesterday, and tomorrow might bring some unexpected turn for the good. As the German advance toward Leningrad continued through July, the flow of refugees and the experience of occupation became increasingly desperate for those caught in the path of the armies. The military situation, the tactical movements that appeared so clean and decisive when viewed from the headquarters of Army Group North, translated on the ground into fear, hunger, displacement, and loss. The civilian landscape of the Baltic lands, those networks of villages and towns, the farmsteads and forests and water routes, the small centers of human culture and commerce that had existed for generations, was being fundamentally and permanently altered by the passage of armies and the imposition of conquest. What would emerge from this crucible over the coming months and years would bear little resemblance to what had existed before. The momentum that had carried German armor across Lithuania and into Latvia could not sustain itself indefinitely, and those who commanded the panzers knew it with a clarity that grew more acute with each passing hour. The Dvina River, flowing from east to west across northwestern Russia, represented not merely a geographic obstacle, but a threshold, a line beyond which the very nature of the campaign would begin to transform. North of Riga, which fell to German forces in early July, the landscape shifted subtly toward what the Germans called the Pripet marshes of the north, a vast, sodden expanse of waterlogged forests, shallow lakes, and ribbon-like rivers that seemed designed by nature to frustrate rapid mechanized advance. The roads, such as they were, began to deteriorate. Trucks that had rumbled reliably across firmer terrain now sank axle-deep into mud. Supply lines, already stretched thin across hundreds of kilometers, became fragile threads. And yet the panzer commanders, men like Erich Hoepner, who commanded the 4th Panzer Group, pressed eastward with an urgency born not from excess confidence, but from strategic imperative. They understood that time itself was their true adversary, for as summer waned, so too would their operational window before autumn rains transformed the landscape into something altogether different. The crossing of the Dvina became the first genuine test of whether German speed could overcome the river's width and the Soviet will to defend it. In the 3rd week of July, after days of fierce fighting through the forests and along the river's western bank, German assault formations managed to establish bridgeheads at several points, each one purchased with casualties that were beginning to accumulate in ways that no one had fully anticipated. The Soviet defenders, initially scattered and demoralized by the speed of the invasion, had begun to coalesce around certain strongpoints. The river itself, perhaps 200 meters across at the crossings, presented an engineering challenge that required careful coordination between infantry, sappers, and armor, a coordination that was easier to order from headquarters maps than to execute under fire. Consider the perspective of a German engineer officer approaching the bank in mid-July, surveying the water with an eye toward establishing pontoon crossings, while Soviet artillery registered fire from the far bank. He would have understood, in those practical terms that soldiers grasp better than generals, that there was a fundamental tension unfolding across the entire front. The panzer divisions wanted to dash, to exploit gaps, to bypass fortified positions, and drive deep into Soviet territory. But they could not move without fuel, without ammunition, without bridging material brought forward by slower-moving motorized infantry and supply columns. And those columns, in turn, depended upon roads that were being torn apart by the very weight of traffic passing over them, day after day, hour after hour. The diary entries and after-action reports from this period reveal a subtle shift in the language of German officers. Early enthusiasm, the sense that the campaign might be finished by autumn or even summer, began to yield to a more measured, almost defensive tone. Distance, it turned out, was not the same as victory. The Soviet Union was simply vast in ways that maps failed to convey. Army Group North's advance had covered perhaps 600 kilometers in the 4 weeks since the invasion began, yet Leningrad still lay another 200 or more kilometers ahead, and the roads beyond the Dvina seemed to promise even greater difficulties. Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb, commanding Army Group North from his headquarters, faced a commander's eternal dilemma: whether to concentrate forces for a breakthrough or to advance along a broad front, hoping to overwhelm Soviet defenses through sheer weight. The panzer divisions, naturally, advocated for bold concentration. The infantry commanders, watching their soldiers grow more fatigued with each kilometer marched under the Baltic sun, counseled for a more deliberate pace. Neither perspective was wrong, which was perhaps the cruelest aspect of military decision-making. Both voices contained truth, and choosing one meant accepting the risks inherent in the other. As German forces established and then expanded their bridgeheads across the Dvina, the psychological character of the campaign began its subtle transformation. The Blitzkrieg, that vision of rapid maneuver and encirclement, had worked brilliantly against dispersed Soviet formations and across open terrain. But rivers demanded different tactics. They required concentration of force, coordination of arms, and most frustratingly, time. Time to bridge, time to assault, time to consolidate. The panzer divisions that crossed the Dvina in late July were already spread thinner than their commanders preferred. Behind them, the motorized infantry struggled with the logistics of sustaining an advance of this distance. Further behind still, the horse-drawn supply trains of the regular infantry divisions toiled along roads that deteriorated, with each rain shower, into ribbons of impassable mud. This was the grinding reality that underlay the broad strategic maps studied in Berlin and Moscow. Individual units might achieve remarkable feats of valor and maneuver. The broader campaign, however, was beginning to reveal its true nature, not a race, but a grinding campaign of attrition against an enemy that, whatever its earlier confusion, was increasingly capable of organizing coherent resistance. The crossing of the Dvina itself, once achieved, opened a path toward Pskov and the approaches to Leningrad. Yet the crossing was never clean or complete. Soviet forces continued to hold pockets on the western bank. Counterattacks materialized from forests, where Soviet units had skillfully withdrawn rather than accepting encirclement. The German advance, though it continued, had lost some essential quality of inevitability. There was now a back-and-forth quality to operations, particularly along the northern flank where Finnish forces, having allied with Germany against their Soviet tormentor, pressed from above while German armor drove from the south. What had seemed like a grand convergence of forces, Germans from the south and west, Finns from the north, began to reveal its own coordination challenges. Supply lines, communication networks, and command relationships between the Wehrmacht and Finnish forces were not as seamless as strategic planning in distant headquarters had suggested. One might wonder whether those who planned Operation Barbarossa had fully reckoned with the difference between a line on a map and the actual, muddy, complicated business of coordinating military operations across vast distances and multiple national armies. The evidence suggests they had not, or perhaps they had understood it intellectually while underestimating its practical weight. By the time German forces had established themselves firmly on the eastern bank of the Dvina and begun their drive toward Pskov, the broader pattern of the campaign was establishing itself. The initial paralysis of Soviet defenses was giving way to organized resistance. The roads ahead were becoming more difficult rather than less. The weather, that great teacher of humility in Eastern European campaigns, was beginning its shift from the heat and dust of June and July toward the autumn rains that would transform the landscape once more. Army Group North had achieved remarkable successes in its opening weeks. Kornus, Riga, crossings of 2 major rivers, yet the drive toward Leningrad was beginning to assume the character less of a sprint and more of a long-distance pursuit. The panzer commanders, feeling the momentum beginning to slip away, pressed harder. The infantry commanders, mindful of their men's fatigue and the lengthening supply lines, counseled patience. And above them all, both von Lieb and the distant Hitler in his headquarters tried to reconcile the reports they received with the timelines they had imagined. It was here, in this tension between the speed that Blitzkrieg demanded and the constraints of geography, supply, and increasingly determined Soviet resistance, that the true nature of the campaign to reach Leningrad would gradually reveal itself, not as a lightning stroke, but as a protracted struggle that would define the coming years. The summer light lingered long in those northern latitudes, and by late July, the forward elements of Army Group North were pushing deeper into what had been Soviet territory for barely a month. The roads behind them were clogged with supply columns, the tanks were blackened with dust and diesel soot, and somewhere ahead lay a city whose name would echo through the ages to come. But before that final drive toward the Baltic's greatest prize, the Germans would encounter a river that seemed, to the weary panzer crews, like merely another obstacle to overcome. Pskov fell almost by accident. This ancient fortress city, with its brick walls reaching back to the medieval centuries, had been a stronghold of Russian culture, of orthodoxy and trade, for 1,000 years. The Soviet commander there, faced with the momentum of German armor and the chaos of the retreat, made the calculation that holding was impossible. The Germans entered on the 8th of July, their motorcycles and scout cars rolling through streets that had seen so much history, only to find them largely empty. What they had expected to be a great battle for a crucial strongpoint turned into something smaller, sadder perhaps, a city surrendered to inevitability rather than one conquered in desperate fighting. Yet this ease of capture concealed something more troubling from the German perspective. The further north and east they advanced, the more the landscape itself seemed to turn against them. The forests grew thicker, more primordial. The roads, never adequate to begin with, deteriorated into ribbons of mud and stone. The distances that had seemed to shrink so rapidly in the opening weeks now began to expand again, as if the earth itself was conspiring to slow the German advance. Supply lines stretched across hundreds of kilometers, vulnerable to guerrilla action, worn down by constant movement. The logistics officers would wake in the night, one might imagine, worried about whether the fuel trucks would arrive in time, whether ammunition would be distributed fairly across so many competing demands. It was perhaps 90 kilometers south of Pskov, where the Soviet defenders began, almost tentatively at first, to make a stand. The Luga River wound through a landscape of lakes and marshes, and along its banks, a defensive line was being hastily constructed. This was not yet the elaborate fortifications that would later characterize the battles around Leningrad itself, but rather a gathering of strength, a moment when the Russians ceased their headlong retreat and began instead to dig in. Who had given the order? Partly it came from Leningrad's military commander, Marshal Kliment Voroshilov, a veteran of the Civil War, a man who understood that you could not let an enemy simply roll across your homeland unopposed. Partly it came from necessity. This was the Luga Line, and it was the last river barrier before the encirclement of Leningrad could be completed. The country around the Luga was not particularly favorable for either attacker or defender. It was wetland and forest in equal measure, punctuated by small villages that had seen little warfare before. The river itself was not especially wide or deep, fordable in many places, but the swampy terrain on both banks meant that any crossing had to be carefully managed. Bridges could be destroyed. Narrow routes could be controlled. In those early days of August, as the German advance began to press against this line, the nature of the campaign fundamentally changed. The panzer groups, which had moved with almost balletic grace through the opening weeks, now found themselves frustrated. Their speed advantage meant less when there was only one road, and that road was held by determined infantry. The 18th Army, under General Adolf Strauss, was supposed to anchor the north of the line. The 16th Army, with more armor at its disposal, was meant to punch through and swing around toward Leningrad's south and east. but the Luga Line was beginning to deny them these maneuvers. Soviet artillery, hastily positioned but growing more numerous, began to exact a cost. Anti-tank guns, laid out by experienced gunners who had learned hard lessons in the retreat, began to knock out the German reconnaissance vehicles that probed too far forward. It is perhaps here that we might ask ourselves what was happening in the minds of the German commanders. They had achieved, in 6 weeks, what the Imperial German Army had failed to achieve in 4 years of the First World War. They had crossed the Baltic states and were within striking distance of Russia's second greatest city. The original plan, optimistic even by the standards of military ambition, had been to take Moscow, Leningrad, and the agricultural heartland, all in a matter of months. But now, in the forests and marshes south of Pskov, the machinery of conquest was beginning to slow. Fuel consumption was higher than expected. Replacements for lost vehicles were not arriving on schedule. The infantry, which had marched hundreds of kilometers in the summer heat, was growing tired. And what of the Russians on the other side of the Luga? They were tired too, certainly, and demoralized by the catastrophes that had befallen their armies in the opening month. Hundreds of thousands of their comrades had been killed, wounded or captured. Entire armies had been encircled and destroyed, or scattered to the winds. The old certainties of Soviet power had been shaken, and yet, as they dug their trenches along the Luga and positioned their guns, something harder was beginning to crystallize in them. This was home. The water they drank came from the Luga. The forests behind them sheltered their families. Leningrad lay ahead, and it was not just a city of strategic importance but the city of their childhoods, of culture and memory. The psychological difference between defending someone else's territory and defending your own home is vast, immeasurable almost, and it would show itself in the days and weeks to come. The German advance, when it came against the Luga Line in earnest, was met with a resistance that surprised many of those who had grown accustomed to Soviet armies melting away before them. Not every attack failed, not every crossing was repulsed. But nothing came easily anymore, and as August progressed, and the casualty lists grew longer, and the summer began its slow fade toward autumn, the soldiers on both sides began to understand that the campaign would not be concluded as quickly as anyone had once believed. The Luga River, modest and overlooked by many students of this war, would mark the moment when the German conquest of Russia began to show its first genuine limits. The drive had been extraordinary, but the destination, Leningrad, waiting in the north like a final test, was still not in German hands, and increasingly, it seemed it might never be. While the German columns pushed northward through that summer of 1941, the machinery of Soviet defense was struggling to comprehend the scale of what had erupted along its western frontier. In Leningrad, nearly 300 kilometers to the north, the early reports arrived in fragments and contradictions, at first almost impossible to reconcile with any coherent picture of the catastrophe unfolding. The Soviet command had anticipated an invasion might come, yes, but the speed, the coordination, the sheer momentum of the German advance seemed to outpace even the most pessimistic contingency plans. And in a city that had endured the Russian Civil War and the long years of Stalin's terror, there settled now a different kind of dread, the ancient fear of an army at the gates. Kirov, the industrial heart of the Leningrad military district, became a hive of feverish activity almost from the moment the first authentic reports of the invasion reached the city's leadership. Factories that had been producing consumer goods, or what passed for them in the Soviet economy, swiftly pivoted to ammunition, artillery pieces, and the components of war. The work accelerated through day and night, in shifts that blurred into an exhausting rhythm, and yet, the city's planners understood something more visceral as well. The Germans were coming not just with armies, but with modern machinery, and Leningrad would need to be defended by more than factory output. It would need to be defended by the population itself. By the end of June, less than a week after Barbarossa had begun, the Soviet authorities made a decision that would transform the civilian landscape of the city in ways both practical and deeply symbolic. They called for the mobilization of the entire city to dig defenses, not just soldiers, not just the organized workforce, but people, ordinary citizens, women and children, the elderly, intellectuals and party members, and factory workers standing side by side. Hundreds of thousands of Leningraders, perhaps as many as 500,000, moved out from the city limits with shovels and pickaxes and bare hands to begin the enormous work of creating an anti-tank barrier line, a fortified ring that might, in the most optimistic calculations, slow a German onslaught. The forests and fields around Leningrad transformed almost overnight into a landscape of human labor. Long trenches began to snake across the earth. Anti-tank ditches were dug, often to depths of 2 or 3 meters, requiring the displacement of soil that seemed endless. Wooden palisades were erected, barbed wire was strung, gun emplacements took shape where there had been only meadow. What is remarkable, in the careful reconstruction of those weeks, is the way this massive civilian mobilization was understood not as conscription in the harshest sense, but as something closer to a civic duty, even a necessity of survival, that many Leningraders seemed to accept with a kind of grim determination. The propaganda was clear: your digging today might save your life tomorrow, but there was something deeper as well, a recognition that Leningrad was now a fortress city in fact as well as in spirit, and that every hand mattered. The elderly women who had survived the civil war understood something of what was coming. The younger workers, many of whom had lost family members in the purges just years before, seemed to dig with a kind of desperation, and the children who participated in these labor brigades learned their first real lessons about the vulnerability of the world they inhabited. The conditions under which this work occurred were often grim: summer heat, insects, the infection of small cuts and wounds that could become serious in those days before modern antibiotics. The work was monotonous and exhausting, and it was never entirely clear whether it would accomplish anything at all. Some of the officials coordinating this effort harbored private doubts about whether such improvised defenses could truly slow a panzer division. But the work continued, day after day, because there was no alternative that did not involve surrender or retreat, and the Soviet leadership had not yet ordered evacuation. Leningrad would stand. It would defend itself, and its people would prepare that defense with their own hands. Into this scene of feverish mobilization came Marshal Kliment Voroshilov, the senior Soviet commander assigned to oversee the defense of Leningrad. Voroshilov was a figure of considerable prestige in the Soviet hierarchy, a longtime associate of Stalin, a Civil War veteran, and in theory, a man of military experience and stature. He had served as Commissar of Defense and had organized the Soviet military in the preceding decades, though his actual military competence had been questioned by more than a few informed observers even before the war began. He was, by many accounts, more of a political figure and a loyal functionary than a brilliant commander, yet he possessed the kind of authority that came from long proximity to power. Stalin trusted him, or trusted him enough, and that was ultimately what mattered in the Soviet system of command. Voroshilov arrived in Leningrad in early July, with the task of coordinating the city's defense against what was already becoming apparent as a German drive of relentless intensity. He threw himself into the work with visible energy, visiting the defensive lines, encouraging the workers, issuing orders for the improvement and expansion of the fortifications. He became, in a sense, the public face of Leningrad's resistance, the embodiment of the city's determination not to yield. His relationship with the city's party leadership, particularly with the influential and astute Andrei Zhdanov, who served as the Communist Party secretary of Leningrad, was complex and sometimes tense, but both men seemed to share a conviction that the city must be held. What role Voroshilov's actual strategic decisions played in the subsequent defense of Leningrad remains a matter of some historical interpretation. He inherited, in a sense, a Soviet military situation in the northwest that was already deeply compromised by earlier defeats and the disorganization induced by the German assault. The Red Army units that should have been defending the approaches to Leningrad were badly mauled, often without adequate coordination, sometimes without clear intelligence about German positions. Voroshilov could do little to change the fundamental strategic imbalance that favored the German offensive. But he could, and did, work to stiffen the resolve of whatever forces remained, to organize the integration of civilian defenses with military ones, and to ensure that when the Germans reached the outer rings of Soviet resistance, they would not find an easy path forward. Whether his leadership was brilliant or merely competent, whether his decisions were sound or merely earnest, the fact remained that Leningrad itself, under his nominal command, was preparing for a siege that no one yet fully imagined would become one of the longest and most devastating in modern history. The summer light held long in those northern latitudes, and the work continued through endless twilight. The population of Leningrad, mobilized in this great collective effort, seemed to understand that something fundamental was at stake, not just a military position, but the survival of a place, a culture, a way of life, however constrained and difficult that life had been. The trenches grew deeper, the barricades rose higher, and in that exhausting labor there was a strange kind of unity, a sense that perhaps, after all the years of suspicion and purge and fear, the city was finally pulling together toward a single, shared purpose. The summer of 1941 had turned hot and close along the northwestern approaches to Leningrad, and something had begun to shift in the rhythm of the German advance. The panzer divisions, which had moved with such confidence and speed through the borderlands and across the Baltic states, found themselves slowing, not stopping, but slowing. The landscape itself had begun to resist them. The Luga River, flowing northeastward toward Lake Ilmen, became the line where Soviet forces chose to make their stand. It was not a dramatic barrier, the Luga, in many places little more than a modest stream, lined with birch and pine, with marshes spreading out on either bank. But it was positioned just far enough from the gates of Leningrad to matter. It lay between the advancing Germans and the city itself, and along its length, in early July, the Soviet command under General Kirill Meretskov had begun to assemble a defensive line, hurriedly, desperately, yet with a determination that surprised German commanders who had grown accustomed to seeing Soviet forces collapse. The defense of the Luga Line was assembled from fragments, reserve divisions, pulled together from the chaos of the retreat, artillery units that had somehow kept their guns, workers' battalions, hastily formed from the factories and streets of Leningrad itself, armed with rifles and grenades, and the knowledge that failure meant the city they called home would fall. Local militia, cadets from military schools. Some of these men and women had never fired a shot in anger before June. Now they dug trenches and prepared fortifications with an urgency that came from proximity, from knowing that the enemy was not some distant threat on another front, but here, moving toward them every day. The terrain favored the defense in ways that the earlier Soviet positions had not. The forests grew thicker here, the roads fewer. Panzer groups could not simply maneuver freely across open country as they had done in Lithuania and Latvia. The marshy ground on either side of the river acted as a brake on rapid movement, and the Luga itself, though narrow, became a fortress line because it had to be, because there was nothing between it and the city. The first engagement along the Luga came around Kingisepp, to the south, where German forces attempted a crossing in early July. The crossing was met with rifle fire and artillery from the Soviet positions on the far bank. The Germans pushed back. A pattern began to emerge, a grinding attrition that was utterly different from the triumphs of the previous weeks. Divisions that had covered 60 kilometers in a day found themselves locked into a battle for a single village for 2 or 3 days. The panzer crews, used to breakthrough warfare, to bypassing strongpoints and letting the infantry deal with them, found themselves called upon to batter through defended positions. Why did the Soviet forces hold so much more determinedly here than elsewhere? Several factors seemed to converge. The approach to Leningrad meant that retreat was no longer possible for units defending this line. Behind them lay the city. Behind the city lay more city and civilians, and the psychological weight of defending what you could see with your own eyes. The defensive positions, hastily as they were prepared, had been sighted by people who knew this ground. Some of the Red Army officers commanding units on the Luga had experienced the First World War in this region. They knew which positions commanded the river crossings. They understood the flow of terrain. And there was something else as well. The German advance had exposed supply lines that were beginning to fray. The further forward that Army Group North pushed, the longer the chain back to the Baltic borderlands, back to the loading points, back to Germany itself. Roads that had been barely adequate in 1940 were now carrying unprecedented volume. Trucks broke down. Fuel consumption exceeded estimates. Ammunition, which had been used lavishly in the breakthrough battles, became more carefully rationed. The panzer divisions found themselves waiting for fuel, waiting for ammunition, waiting for repairs. The momentum was slipping away like water through cupped hands. The Soviet forces, for all their disorganization and the catastrophic losses of the opening weeks, possessed the advantage of fighting close to home. Leningrad could send reinforcements forward. The city was producing ammunition. The psychological reality of defending your own home works in favor of the defender, even when that defender is vastly outnumbered and outgunned. And along the Luga, the Soviets were not vastly outnumbered, not anymore. They were certainly outgunned in artillery, and especially in air power. But in terms of raw infantry, the balance was shifting. Reserves from elsewhere on the Soviet frontier were being redirected northward. The city itself was being emptied of fighting men to feed the line. Through July, the fighting along the Luga took on a character of painful incrementalism. German attacks would be launched, carefully coordinated between panzer support and infantry assault. Some would penetrate the Soviet line, others would be beaten back. The Soviets would counterattack, trying to push the Germans back from the river. These counterattacks were often costly, sometimes futile, but they had a psychological effect. They showed the German commanders that this enemy was not demoralized. This enemy would stand and fight. One might wonder, at this distance in time, what the ordinary soldier on either side was experiencing during these weeks of summer. For the Germans, there was frustration setting in. The great victory seemed to be slipping away. Casualty figures, which had been mercifully light during the breakthrough, were mounting. The weather, which had been cooperation, was becoming an adversary. The heat brought dust and insects. The rare rains turned the few roads into mud. Supplies came slower. For the Soviet soldiers, there was something different. A grim knowledge that they were being asked to fight for their own ground, their own homes, knowing that failure meant occupation, and perhaps, in some cases, knowledge of what occupation meant. The Luga Line held through July, not perfectly. German forces managed to establish small bridgeheads on the eastern bank. The line was pushed back in some places, but it held. The German momentum, which had seemed unstoppable in June, had been checked, and as July became August, the question that must have haunted both commands became clearer. How much longer could this continue? How many more soldiers would die for the Luga River, which was neither tactically brilliant nor strategically decisive, but simply a river in the way, a place where two great armies had collided, and neither could simply walk over the other anymore. The woods were green along the Luga in August, and the nights were brief, the northern sun barely dipping below the horizon. In that perpetual twilight, the war in northwestern Russia became something other than the blitzkrieg that Hitler had promised. It became a test of will and endurance, a grinding away of men and machines, and the false certainties that had begun the operation 3 months before. As the German advance drew closer, day by day, hour by hour, the character of the moment began to shift from one of military maneuver to something far more personal, far more cultural. For it was not merely a city that lay in the path of Army Group North's momentum, but a place that held within its very stones the memory of a civilization, a repository of human beauty accumulated across centuries. Leningrad, once St. Petersburg, once the imperial heart of Russia itself, sat upon the delta of the Neva River, where it opens into the Gulf of Finland, a city built on swamps and water by the will of Peter the Great, who had envisioned a window to the west, where none should naturally exist. The city had been founded in 1703, a monument to ambition and defiance. Where marshland and birch forest had once prevailed, palaces rose in stone and gilt. The Winter Palace, with its pale blue and white facade, had become the center of an empire. And around it, across the Neva's broad expanse, merchants had built their mansions, artists had gathered in salons lit by candle and later electric light, and a culture of extraordinary richness had taken root. By the 20th century, Leningrad was not merely a political capital that had moved to Moscow after the revolution, but something perhaps more significant still, a custodian of beauty, a spiritual heir to 4 centuries of Russian imperial grandeur. At the very heart of this legacy stood the Hermitage, that vast palace museum that had been the private collection of the Romanovs before the revolution transformed it into a public treasure. Within its endless corridors and galleries hung some of the greatest paintings ever created. Works by Rembrandt and Rubens, by Leonardo and Caravaggio, sculptures from ancient Greece and Rome, decorative arts of such delicacy and craftsmanship that they seemed almost to speak of worlds now lost. The Hermitage contained, by one careful count, more than 2 million objects, paintings, drawings, sculptures, ceramics, textiles, manuscripts. To walk through those galleries was to walk through the aesthetic memory of Europe itself. As the Panzer columns rolled northward through the summer of 1941, the city's curators and administrators faced a question that must have seemed impossible even to contemplate. How do you save what cannot be carried? How do you protect the irreplaceable when armies are advancing and the future is unknowable? The decision was made, quietly but firmly, to evacuate. Not the entire collection, that would have been physically impossible, but the most precious works, the ones whose loss would constitute a wound to human civilization itself. Beginning in the late spring of 1941, even before the invasion, there had been whispers of concern, rumors of war. By early summer, the work began in earnest. Conservators and museum staff moved through the galleries with a kind of reverent haste, carefully removing paintings from their frames, rolling them in acid-free paper, packing them into wooden crates. Each piece was documented, catalogued, numbered, as if bearing witness to what was being taken away. The logistics were staggering. The paintings had to be transported by rail, thousands of kilometers eastward, to cities deeper in the Soviet interior, where the advancing German armies could not reach. Some went to Sverdlovsk in the Urals. Others were divided among other safe repositories. Entire galleries were packed and sent into the unknown, traveling on trains that were themselves vulnerable, that had to compete for track with military transport, with refugees, with the desperate movement of a nation trying to preserve what could be preserved while preparing for invasion. There was something almost poignant in the very act of packing these paintings away. It implied, did it not, a certain belief that the city itself might not survive intact, that beauty might have to be hidden, separated from its home, in order to endure at all. The curators were not pessimists by nature. They were lovers of their collections, devoted to their work, but they understood, with a clarity that must have been almost unbearable, that they were witnessing the possible ending of an era. The city that had produced such richness might soon be torn apart by war. And yet, even as the paintings were being packed, life in Leningrad continued. The city's population had swelled to nearly 3 million souls by the spring of 1941. Workers in factories, families in apartments, musicians and writers and scientists who had made the city a center of Soviet intellectual life. The Kirov Ballet still performed. The Philharmonic still gave concerts. There was a kind of determined normalcy that overlay everything, a sense that somehow the city would endure, that this moment of threat would pass, as moments of threat had passed before. But those who worked in the Hermitage knew better. They understood, as they wrapped precious paintings and loaded them onto trains, that they were saying goodbye to something, to the peacetime arrangement of the world, perhaps, to the assumption that beauty would remain accessible, that the great works of human creativity would remain in the places where they belonged. They were creating, in essence, a diaspora of culture, sending the city's greatest treasures into exile, trusting that someday, somehow, they might return. By the summer of 1941, nearly 1.5 million pieces had been evacuated from the Hermitage and other Leningrad museums. The galleries themselves were being closed. The empty walls, the unfilled spaces where masterpieces had hung, must have felt like a kind of violation, a haunting absence. What remained was the city itself, its architecture, its parks, its bridges crossing the Neva. What remained was a place that had stood for nearly 2.5 centuries, a city that had survived Napoleon and civil war and revolution. Could it survive this too? In the quietness of that question lies a kind of meditation on what we consider worth saving, and why. Here were military commanders focused on the conquest of territory, on the seizure of cities and resources, and here, running parallel to that brutal logic, were curators and conservators and ordinary people moved by the conviction that some things, paintings, sculptures, the accumulated witnesses to human beauty, were worth the extraordinary effort of rescue. They could not stop the armies, they could not turn back the invasion, but they could at least, they thought, preserve this. The southern approaches to Leningrad, as the late August heat began to soften into the first whispers of autumn, presented the German command with an almost hypnotic tactical problem. The road south from the conquered Luga positions wound through a landscape of low, forested hills and scattered settlements, each one a small decision point where Soviet rearguards could slow, resist, and melt away into the vastness of the forests beyond. And yet, despite the difficulty of the terrain, despite the lengthening supply lines, and the fatigue that had begun to settle into the bones of the advancing panzer crews, Hoepner's mobile formations, and the mechanized divisions following in their wake, pressed relentlessly toward two objectives that would, in the minds of the German planners, close the final ring around the great city. Novgorod lay some 90 kilometers to the south and east, an ancient stronghold that had existed for more than 1,000 years on the Volkhov River, its name itself meaning new fortification in Old Slavic. To reach it meant pushing through terrain that became increasingly difficult with each kilometer, marshlands alternating with dense birch and pine forest, roads that turned to mud with the slightest rain, and distances that seemed to expand in a soldier's mind with each passing day. The Soviet forces defending this southern approach were themselves fragments, hastily gathered from multiple retreating armies, some units so depleted and disoriented that they could offer only scattered resistance before fragmenting again into smaller groups, each trying to find a way north or westward to avoid encirclement. But there were enough of them, scattered enough through the forest, organized enough in a few places, to make the advance something other than a simple corridor through open country. The German forces tasked with taking Novgorod included elements of the 16th Army under Ernst Busch, moving with that relentless, almost mechanical precision that had become the hallmark of the Wehrmacht's operations. Infantry divisions, many of them still on foot despite the speed of the campaign, were supplemented by motorcycle reconnaissance units and armored elements that probed ahead, testing each Soviet position before the weight of German firepower and numbers eventually overwhelmed it. The approach to Novgorod itself became a series of progressively sharper engagements through the first 2 weeks of September, skirmishes that individually were not significant, but cumulatively represented the wearing down of Soviet cohesion in the region. One might imagine the steady rhythm of these advances, the reconnaissance elements pushing forward, reporting back what they found, the infantry divisions shortening their marching columns to move faster, the artillery moving up to blast any hint of organized resistance, and the whole enormous machine grinding forward by kilometers each day. What made Novgorod's fall strategically significant, though it might have seemed like merely another Soviet city falling to the German advance, was its position on the Volkhov River. The river itself, moving south from Lake Ilmen, represented one of the few geographic features that might have offered a Soviet commander a line upon which to stand and fight, a position that could be reinforced and held, at least for a time. And indeed, there were moments when it seemed as though the Soviets might attempt to make a stand on the river's western bank, gathering forces, preparing defensive positions, organizing the kind of concentrated resistance that had not been possible in the fluid retreat of the previous weeks. But the German encirclement, or the threat of it, never quite materialized in the way that such operations were supposed to. The Soviet forces, whether through the prudence of their commanders or the inherent chaos of the retreat, managed to pull back across the river before the German panzer units could wheel around and cut off their escape routes. And so Novgorod fell, sometime in the second week of September, to advancing German infantry and armor, its ancient streets occupied, its population displaced, and the German advance continuing onward. To the west, meanwhile, another thrust was being developed, a secondary but no less important push aimed at Chudovo, a smaller town that lay on the railway line running south from Leningrad toward Moscow. The railway itself, though damaged and disrupted, remained one of the crucial supply arteries in the region, and whoever controlled Chudovo controlled a vital section of that line. The town was perhaps 60 kilometers south of Leningrad, close enough that German artillery would eventually be able to reach the city's suburbs, near enough that the psychological weight of the approaching armies would become tangible to the population in the streets and in the shelters of Leningrad itself. The forces driving toward Chudovo included elements of panzer groups and motorized divisions, units that by this point in the campaign were beginning to show the strain of continuous operations, mechanical breakdowns increasing, ammunition supplies stretched thin, and the men themselves running on a combination of ideology, habit, and the simple momentum of forward movement. The capture of Chudovo in the middle of September 1941 marked a subtle but profound shift in the tactical situation around Leningrad. For the first time, the encirclement was beginning to take on a tangible shape. The Germans now held the southern approaches to the city, and more significantly, they held them in sufficient strength that the possibility of a Soviet breakout or relief operation from the south was becoming increasingly theoretical rather than practical. The roads from the interior of the Soviet Union toward Leningrad, the railways that might have brought reinforcements and supplies, were now either under German control or so threatened by German forces that they could be used only under constant peril. One might pause to reflect on what this meant for the city itself. The realization, perhaps, that the outside world was being progressively sealed off, that relief would not come from the south, that whatever resources existed within the city walls would have to sustain its population. The noose tightened further as September progressed. German forces continued to push eastward from the Chudovo area, extending their lines along the southern perimeter of Leningrad's approaches, meeting increasing resistance but continuing nonetheless, driven by the momentum of the campaign and by the knowledge that the autumn rains would soon make the terrain even more difficult for large-scale military operations. Each success, each kilometer gained, each road seized, seemed to confirm the German conviction that Leningrad's fall was merely a matter of time, that the great city would soon be in German hands, and that the drive to the Baltic would be complete. Whether this conviction was justified by the military realities, or whether it rested on assumptions that would soon be tested by the stubborn reality of Soviet resistance and the approaching winter, remained to be seen. The siege would come to be remembered, not as a moment of conquest, but as a moment of closure. And that moment, the one that turned a campaign of advance into an entrapment, arrived on a grey September morning when Schlüsselburg fell into German hands. It was the 8th of September, 1941, and with that small fortress town, the last overland corridor connecting Leningrad to the rest of the Soviet Union was sealed shut. The drive had finally accomplished what 3 months of relentless thrust through forests and across rivers could not. It had isolated a city of nearly 3 million souls from the world beyond. To understand what Schlüsselburg meant, one must first picture its position. There, where the Neva River flowed out of Lake Ladoga, this small fortress sat like a cork in a bottle. For centuries, it had guarded approaches and controlled movement between the inland sea and the river's passage northward to the Baltic. The Germans, now exhausted from weeks of pursuit, recognized its strategic weight immediately. If they could take it, if they could place artillery and troops along that narrow corridor where water and land met, then nothing, and no one could reach Leningrad from the east without their permission. The city would no longer be a destination at the end of a supply line. It would become an island, surrounded not by water, but by German guns and the vastness of Soviet territory that stretched away toward Moscow. The assault on Schlisselburg had been building for days. Soviet defenders, aware of its importance, fought with desperate intensity. The fortress itself was small, ancient in places, its walls commanding the narrows of the Neva. German infantry, supported by artillery and tanks wherever the terrain allowed them, pressed forward from multiple directions. The fighting was close, brutal, the kind of street-level conflict that drains armies. And yet, as had so often been the case in these first months of the invasion, the German momentum, though flagging, still outweighed Soviet endurance. When the fortress finally fell, when the last defenders were killed or captured, and when German troops raised their flags over those stone walls, something profound shifted in the nature of the entire campaign. The drive to Leningrad was no longer a drive, it had become a siege. Can we pause and consider what that means, really? The difference between an assault that seeks to crush a city and an encirclement that seeks to starve it. The former is terrible, but swift. The latter is something altogether different. It is patient. It is suffocating. It is, in many ways, more devastating because it unfolds across months, not hours. The German soldiers who now looked north across the Neva toward the distant city may not have fully grasped this at first. They had been moving forward for so long that stopping, even at the gates of their objective, felt almost unnatural. Orders were orders. They had been told to surround Leningrad, not to take it by storm. Hitler's preference, communicated down through Wehrmacht channels, was that the city should be reduced by siege, by starvation if necessary, rather than lost in urban combat that would consume men and materiel. It was a calculation, cold and distant from the reality of the soldiers on the ground. But it was a calculation that now governed what would happen next. The encirclement tightened with almost casual finality. German forces now held a line that curved from south to west to north, pressing the city against the waters of the Gulf of Finland. Russian forces still held the eastern approaches, still held the land route that led away toward the hinterland, but that route could now be interdicted. Supplies that had been flowing in, albeit unevenly, could be choked off. And with Schlisselburg in German hands, the Neva became a barrier that the Soviets could not cross in force. The fortress sat like a sentinel at the river's outlet from the lake, and nothing moved on that waterway without German knowledge. What did this mean for the 3 million people inside the city? At first, they did not fully understand. There had been evacuation before, steady streams of civilians and military dependents moving eastward on rail and truck. But the city itself, vast and industrial, and somehow confident in its Soviet might, still possessed the sense that this encirclement was temporary. Surely, the thinking went, the Red Army would counterattack. Surely, the Germans could not maintain this grip forever. History, and the length of Russia itself, seemed on the side of those trapped within the city's boundaries. But those who understood logistics, who understood the fragility of supply lines and the mathematics of how many calories 3 million people need to survive a winter in the Arctic North, felt a different kind of dread. The fall of Schlisselburg was not merely a military fact. It was a death sentence pronounced silently, to be carried out slowly, across months, with cold and hunger as executioners. The fortress town, with its ancient walls and strategic position, had just become one of the most significant places on the entire Eastern Front, not because of what happened there in those final hours of fighting, but because of what its fall meant for everything that would happen after. By the first week of September, with Schlisselburg fallen and the land corridor to Leningrad severed, a peculiar and fateful question crystallized in the minds of Germany's highest command. The city lay within reach. The outer defenses had crumbled. Army Group North's spearheads were fewer than 20 kilometers from the first urban districts, and yet no order came to assault. Instead, a different strategy began to take shape, one that would transform the campaign from a race of conquest into something far more patient and far more terrible. Hitler's decision, in those late summer days, was to encircle rather than storm, to siege rather than assault. It is a choice that has puzzled historians ever since, carrying within it a paradox that still echoes through the decades. Why would a commander, having invested so much momentum and blood to reach a great city, suddenly opt for waiting instead of overwhelming force? The answer, in its way, is both logical and deeply troubling. The practical reasoning began with the arithmetic of urban warfare. Leningrad, in 1941, was the Soviet Union's second city, a sprawling metropolis of some 3 million souls spread across islands and peninsulas along the Neva River. Its streets were narrow, its buildings substantial, its defenders numerous and increasingly organized. Any attempt to force entry house by house would demand resources, men, ammunition, time, that Army Group North, after 2 months of continuous advance, was beginning to feel the strain of mustering. The Wehrmacht had learned brutal lessons in Poland and France about the cost of taking defended cities. Moscow itself was still the distant prize, the true objective that Berlin believed would break Soviet power. Why exhaust the army in Leningrad when patience and the tightening of a noose might achieve the same end at far lower cost? There was also a calculation about supply. The German logistics system, already stretched across hundreds of kilometers of conquered territory, was increasingly fragile. Every division that had to pause to capture a city was a division that consumed rations, fuel, and ammunition while remaining stationary. A siege required fewer active soldiers per square kilometer than an assault. The blockade line could be held, maintained, watched. Starvation would do the work that bullets would otherwise have to accomplish. Yet there was something else woven through these rational considerations, something that speaks to the darker currents of Nazi ideology and strategy. Hitler harbored a personal contempt for Leningrad, the former Petrograd, the birthplace of the Russian Revolution. He had no intention of occupying it as a functioning city or preserving its people. In his vision, Leningrad was to be erased, not conquered, but obliterated. The siege, from this perspective, was not a military compromise, but a deliberate instrument of destruction. The city would be starved. Its population would perish. When finally, perhaps years later, German forces entered the ruins, there would be nothing left but debris and memory. This is a bitter reality to contemplate, and historians have sometimes debated whether Hitler explicitly ordered the city's destruction as a siege objective, or whether the outcome emerged from a more general indifference to civilian suffering, combined with practical military reasoning. What seems clear, though it is often spoken of with hesitation, is that the decision to besiege rather than assault effectively sentenced Leningrad to a particular kind of doom, not the quick death of battle, but the slow, grinding death of blockade. The German High Command was not entirely unanimous in this choice. Some field officers, accustomed to the rapid victories of blitzkrieg, chafed at the notion of settling into a static siege. There was, among certain commanders, a lingering belief that one more decisive push might shatter the Soviet defenses and open the way into the city before winter truly set in. But Hitler's word, transmitted through Wehrmacht hierarchy, was final. The city would be encircled, the ring would close, and whatever happened within that ring was, in the calculations of Berlin, the Soviet Union's responsibility, not Germany's. By mid-September, as the last roads leading into Leningrad were cut and the encirclement became complete, the die was cast. The strategy of siege had been chosen. Whether it was chosen coldly, as a practical military decision to conserve resources, or whether it was chosen with full knowledge of the human cost it would impose, whether it represented military pragmatism or something closer to deliberate design, remains a question that cannot be answered with absolute certainty from the documents that survive. What is certain is that from that moment forward, Army Group North ceased to be an army of conquest and became an army of containment. The drive had ended, the wait had begun. And in the city beyond the lines, as word spread through Leningrad's population that the German ring was tightening, that the roads to the east were closing, that this was no longer a temporary crisis, but a transformed reality. A different kind of struggle was already beginning to take shape. The evacuation efforts, which had been tentative and often chaotic, now became desperate. The ice roads were still months away. The only escape route that remained was across the waters of Lake Ladoga to the east, and even that would not remain open for long. As the encirclement tightened around Leningrad through those crucial September days, a peculiar window of time opened and began to close with each passing hour. The land route was severed, yes, but the waters of Lake Ladoga to the city's east remained, for now, still traversable. And in that narrowing corridor between siege and survival, a quiet, desperate race unfolded. The lake itself was vast and cold, a body of water that stretched some 90 kilometers in length and up to 50 kilometers across at its widest point. Even in September, when the warmth of summer had begun its retreat, Ladoga held the memory of ice in its depths, but not yet, not quite yet. The waters were still liquid, still passable, and so began what would later be called, with a kind of gentle memorializing, the airlift of the lakes. The road of life, the Soviets would name it, though the first crossing felt less like a deliberate highway and more like a tentative thread thrown across an abyss. The evacuation efforts that commenced in those final days of September took many forms. Some relied on small motorized vessels, fast patrol boats, and improvised transports that could ferry supplies inbound, and civilians and wounded outbound. Others depended on something far more fragile still, rowing boats, barges, even rafts lashed together with ropes and desperation. Imagine the scene on the shores of the beleaguered city as dusk fell and the chill came down from the north. Families gathering what few possessions might fit into a boat. Children clutching dolls or photographs. The elderly moving with the slowness of people who knew they might not see the other shore. And above all, the silence, not the silence of peace, but the silence of people trying not to draw the attention of German guns, positioned on the heights overlooking the lake's western margins. The numbers evacuated across those waters in those early weeks were relatively modest by the standards of what was to come. Perhaps a few thousand managed to slip across in the darkness, heading eastward toward the relative safety of the inland Soviet territories, toward towns and villages that had not yet been drawn into the maelstrom of invasion. But the psychological significance of those crossings cannot be overstated. Each boat that departed was a statement, however faint, that Leningrad was not yet wholly sealed off from the world. Each journey across Ladoga's cold surface represented a thin thread of connection, fragile and fraying, but not yet completely severed. The city's cultural treasures were among those being moved across the lake. Paintings and sculptures from the Hermitage, manuscripts and documents of incalculable value, carefully packed and transported on small vessels, heading east toward the safety of distant repositories. There was something almost ethereal about this process, the notion of human creation and human memory being ferried across dark water while armies clashed on the surrounding shores. The museum itself, once thronged with visitors from across the world, was being gradually hollowed of its contents, even as its walls remained defiant. But as September turned toward October, the waters of Ladoga began to show the first true signs of the approaching winter. The nights grew longer. The wind picked up from the north with increasing intensity. Temperatures that had hovered near freezing began to drop more reliably, more persistently. The water's surface took on a different quality in the early morning light, a stiffness, a glassiness that suggested ice forming at its periphery. And with each passing night, the window for evacuation by boat grew narrower. The Soviet authorities faced a calculus both tragic and entirely practical. How many more people could be evacuated before the lake froze solid? How long would they have before surface vessels could no longer navigate the developing ice? The early motorized crossings had been relatively swift, but as the water grew colder and the ice began to form in scattered patches across the lake's surface, each journey became increasingly fraught with uncertainty and danger. Vessels became trapped in expanding sheets of ice. Navigation became treacherous. The journey that might have taken a few hours in mid-September could stretch into an entire night of careful maneuvering and desperate pushing through fragmenting ice floes. There was a particular poignancy in the evacuation of children during this period. Some were separated from their mothers, deemed small enough and light enough to be moved to safety quickly, while parents remained behind to face whatever was coming. One can almost hear the wailing that must have echoed across those shores as boats pulled away from the docks, laden with children whose futures seemed suddenly, abruptly uncertain. Some of these evacuations were organized with at least a measure of official coordination. Others were far more chaotic, with families scattering across the docks in the fading light, seeking any vessel willing to take them eastward. As October progressed and the first genuine frosts arrived, the character of the evacuation shifted. The motorized boats became fewer and fewer as German air raids and artillery fire took their toll on the lake traffic. But something else was beginning to happen. Something that would transform Ladoga from a barrier into a lifeline. The ice was forming, not everywhere, not continuously, but in patches and plates and expanding sheets. The frozen surface of the lake began to present a possibility that had seemed impossible during the warm months. What if the lake could become a road instead of a barrier? The scouts went out first, tentatively, across the thickening ice. They walked carefully, testing each step, listening to the creaks and groans of the ice beneath their feet, alert to every sound that might indicate instability or danger. There were losses, men who broke through and vanished into the black water below, their cries muffled by the cold. But gradually, over days and then weeks, the ice grew thick enough to bear weight, heavy weight, eventually the weight of trucks. For now, though, as autumn settled into its final phase, the evacuation across Ladoga remained a matter of boats and desperate journeys through deteriorating conditions. The last substantial evacuations by water took place in late October, as the ice finally made further navigation impossible. After that, for several weeks, Leningrad would be utterly isolated. No boats could cross. The ice was not yet thick enough for heavy transport. The city would wait in that strange liminal space, surrounded by enemies on the land and separated by formidable, impassable ice from potential relief or rescue. Yet even as this phase of the evacuation concluded, a different kind of preparation was underway. The Soviet engineers were testing the ice, measuring its thickness, contemplating the possibility of something unprecedented, a convoy system, not of ships, but of sleds and carts, and eventually trucks, moving across the surface of a frozen lake in the midst of winter, supplying a starving city. It was a concept born of desperation, yes, but also of a kind of grim ingenuity, a determination to find solutions where none seemed to exist. The last days of open access to Leningrad had a dreamlike quality to them, if such a term can be applied to a moment of historical urgency and human suffering. The lights of the city were visible from across the lake, a faint glow on the darkening eastern horizon, and with each night that passed, with each degree that the temperature dropped, that glow seemed to grow fainter, more distant, as though the city itself was beginning to fade from the world. The people on those evacuation boats, looking back toward the shore they were leaving, could not have known precisely what was coming. They understood, in a general way, that privation was approaching. But the full scope of the siege to come, the months of hunger, the disease, the desperate calculations about which family members might be expendable, the slow attrition of human life measured in hundreds of thousands, that knowledge was mercifully withheld from them. All they knew, in those late autumn nights on the cold waters of Lake Ladoga, was that they were leaving, and that those they left behind were now, finally, truly alone. And yet beneath the calculations of command, in the muddy shelters and hastily dug foxholes that now stretched across the Baltic landscape, there existed a quieter world of small, intimate human moments. The soldiers themselves, whether German infantrymen or Soviet conscript, were occupying a strange psychological space, one that many had not anticipated when the first shells fell and the first orders came to move forward into what they believed would be a swift campaign. Letters home from this period, preserved in archives across Eastern Europe and Germany, reveal men grappling with a peculiar exhaustion, not yet the desperation of true siege, but something more unsettling, the dawning realization that the war would not end as promised. A German Wehrmacht soldier writing to his family in Bremen in late August might describe the endless forests, the way they seem to swallow distances and make men feel small, how the roads turned to mud after rain, and slowed even the panzer columns that had moved with such promise through Lithuania and Latvia. He would speak of the cold creeping into his bones despite the summer month, of sleeping in shifts in slit trenches that never quite stayed dry, of the peculiar hunger that came not from true starvation, but from rations that left a man perpetually unsatisfied. The field kitchen rarely caught up with the advance. Bread became hard and sour. The coffee substitute was thin and tasted of chicory. Canned meat sat in the stomach like lead. And yet, he might write, the officers still insisted they were close, that Leningrad was only days away, that the campaign would be finished before autumn turned to winter. The promise endured even as the pace slowed, even as the resistance stiffened, even as men began to notice things that suggested otherwise. Rations in the Wehrmacht, by this stage of the campaign, were designed for offensive movement, not encampment. The supply system was already beginning to show strain. Hot meals came irregularly. When they came, they were often thin soups made from whatever could be foraged or found in abandoned Soviet stores: potatoes, turnips, occasionally preserved meat from livestock slaughtered in passing. The daily ration included black bread, margarine if available, cheese, sometimes sausage, cigarettes that served as a kind of currency among the men. Many soldiers smoked to suppress the appetite. There was a peculiar camaraderie in shared deprivation, a way in which men bound together through small economies of survival, trading ration items, sharing photographs from home, composing letters together that would be censored before posting. For the Soviet defenders gathering along the Luga River and preparing the trenches and anti-tank obstacles around Leningrad, the situation was different in character, but perhaps not entirely different in weight. Letters from Soviet soldiers captured in this period, or those recovered from the bodies of the fallen, speak of confusion and displacement, of mobilization that happened so quickly that men scarcely understood where they were going or why. The Soviets were also hungry, though their rations were sometimes more modest still. Black bread again, salted fish, occasionally a thin meat broth. The psychological state, however, carried its own particular gravity. These were men defending their homeland, defending their city, and yet many were newly conscripted or hastily reorganized from scattered units that had been shattered in the opening weeks of the invasion. There was pride in this, but also deep uncertainty. Would the defenses hold? Could they hold? The ordinary soldier on both sides, as summer turned toward autumn in the northern forest, began to inhabit a strange middle ground. The initial shock of invasion had passed. The initial rush of advancing or retreating had ceased. Now came something that many would later describe as harder in its own way: the settling in, the digging of deeper shelters, the realization that rain would come, and then snow, the psychological weight of a front that was no longer moving, at least not with the speed or clarity of those first weeks. Men had time to think now, and thinking could be more exhausting than action. Perhaps it is worth pausing to consider what the body experiences in such circumstances, the way that waiting, constant alertness, inadequate food, cold ground, and the proximity of danger combine into a specific kind of fatigue. It is not the deep sleep of true exhaustion, but rather a shallow, interrupted rest punctuated by sudden sounds, by shifts in duty, by dreams that blend memory and fear. A soldier might close his eyes in a trench and find himself back home in a room he had not seen in months, and then a sound would wake him, or the man next to him would shift, and he would return to the reality of guns and wire and the invisible enemy beyond the trees. The letters home, when they could be written and posted, became almost ritualized. They contained little of the actual experience, due to censorship, but they contained everything that needed to be conveyed. I am still alive. I think of you. I hope this reaches you. There was a phrase that appeared in many such letters, a phrase that suggested the writer was already beginning to understand that he might be trapped in this place for longer than the command had promised. It went something like this: "We wait now. The war has slowed. We do not know what comes next." The specificity of that not knowing may have been the most difficult thing of all. In swift advance, or in rapid retreat, men had narrative, direction, purpose, even if that purpose was survival. But in a stalemate, in the settling of a front, there was only the present moment, repeated endlessly, with no certain future beyond it. The psychological literature on static warfare, though much of it would come later in the 20th century, suggests that the human mind struggles with indefinite stasis in a context of danger. Unlike garrison duty, where men can relax somewhat, or rapid movement, where adrenaline keeps fatigue at bay, a static front demands constant readiness from the nervous system without ever releasing it. Men became irritable. Small conflicts between soldiers in the same unit increased. There was less joking as the weeks passed, less of the dark humor that had emerged in the opening days. Instead, there was a kind of grim acceptance, a settling into the routines of shell and shovel, of watch and wait. Among the German soldiers of Army Group North in particular, as September approached, there was also the question of supplies, growing more acute with each passing week. The invasion had been planned with a time limit in mind. Moscow, and in this sector Leningrad, were supposed to fall before the onset of winter. The logistics of the invasion assumed no extended campaign in northern latitudes during the cold months. Now, however, as it became clear that the city would not fall quickly, as Soviet resistance hardened and the German advance slowed, questions began to whisper through the ranks. What happened if they had to winter here? What happened if the supply lines became even more stretched? What happened if they were ordered to assault the city across open ground against organized defenses? The men did not yet know the answer, and neither, in truth, did the command structure. They only knew that they were tired, that they were hungry, that the weather would change, and that the campaign that was supposed to be finished was nowhere near finished. And in that uncertainty, in that gap between promise and reality, they waited, wrote letters they hoped would reach home, shared rations and cigarettes and whatever warmth human contact could provide, and tried not to think too deeply about the winter that was coming, the siege that was settling into place, and the vast machinery of history in which they had become small, indispensable, and increasingly trapped components. The autumn light across the Baltic began to change in ways that officers on both sides would have recognized as a warning. September had turned the forests bronze and ochre, and by October, the first frosts arrived to harden the roads that had turned to mud during the final thrusts toward Leningrad. For Army Group North, the shift from offense to siege was not announced with ceremony or formal order, but rather emerged as a slow compression of possibilities, as if the vast landscape that had opened before them in June was gradually closing its doors. Field Marshal von Lieb understood what the calendar was telling him. The hope that had sustained the rapid panzer advance, the belief that Leningrad might be captured before winter settled in, had begun to fade by late September, and by the time October rain began to fall, it was clear that the city would not be taken by storm. The decision to contain rather than assault was made not all at once, but in increments, as exhaustion, supply difficulties, and stiffening Soviet resistance accumulated into a single, inescapable realization. The drive had become a cordon, and the cordon would become a siege. What does an army do when its momentum is arrested? It digs. Along the entire perimeter that German forces had established around Leningrad, and southward along the roads toward Moscow, soldiers began the laborious work of transforming temporary positions into something meant to endure. Trenches deepened, barbed wire was strung through forests, machine gun nests were placed with care at focal points where Soviet counterattacks might develop. The 16th Army, holding the southern sectors, began to construct field fortifications that reflected the grim acceptance that this would be a line of position, not a launching point for further advance. The pace of work was uneven, shaped by the deepening cold and the particular challenges of digging into frozen or semi-frozen ground. Soldiers who had trained for mobile warfare now found themselves engaged in the unglamorous, exhausting work of entrenchment, and there is perhaps something profoundly deflating about such a transition, a recognition that the dramatic arc of invasion has flattened into something more static, more durable, and in many ways more bitter. Supply lines stretched back toward the Baltic, hundreds of kilometers long and vulnerable to partisan activity. Fuel, which had powered the rapid advances of summer, became precious and rationed. Provisions grew thinner as the German quartermaster services struggled to maintain supply to troops that were no longer advancing and therefore no longer living off the land. The soldiers themselves, those who had marched from East Prussia with the belief that they would be home by winter, began to understand that winter would find them in the field, in hastily prepared positions, at the gates of a city that showed no signs of surrendering. Letters written in October and November strike a consistent note of weariness and deflation, pride in what had been accomplished mixed with a dawning comprehension of what lay ahead. One officer, whose diary survives, wrote that the men's spirits had shifted from the exuberance of June to something more like resolve, the kind of determination that settles in when there is nothing left to do but endure. The perimeter around Leningrad was never a simple circle. It sprawled across terrain of extraordinary difficulty. Forest, swamp, and lake created gaps and weak points that had to be monitored constantly. Lake Ladoga, frozen over by December, became a white expanse that Soviet forces on the eastern shore might theoretically use to move supplies or mount operations, and so German positions along its western shore had to be reinforced and watched with particular vigilance. The southern approaches to the city, where the Luga Line had been bested, required constant vigilance against Soviet attempts to break the encirclement or restore supply routes. This was not a front that stood still, even in autumn. It bristled with minor actions, probing attacks, and the wearing friction of proximity to an enemy that never truly ceased attempting to preserve or restore its lifelines. To the south, beyond Lake Peipus, the 16th Army stretched its forces thin across the approaches to Pskov and beyond, maintaining a connection to Army Group Center's operations and guarding against the possibility of Soviet forces attempting to relieve Leningrad by operating from that direction. The problem of stretch and thinness that had plagued the German advance, that fundamental imbalance between the territory conquered and the manpower available to hold it, had not gone away. It had merely become chronic, a condition of existence rather than a temporary embarrassment. Divisions that had numbered 20,000 men in June were pared down to 5,000 or 6,000 by November, with no replacements visible on the horizon. The Soviet army, from its perspective, faced an almost equally daunting reckoning. The encirclement was complete as of September 8th, and despite multiple attempts at counterattack, Soviet forces had been unable to break the ring. Winter was coming, which would be merciless to an besieged population, but would also grant certain advantages to defenders operating from prepared positions close to their supply sources. The city itself, barely visible through the autumn haze to German observers on the nearby heights, was being prepared for siege with a terrible single-mindedness. Civilians continued to dig fortifications, even as food stocks were being calculated and rationed. How does a transition of this magnitude settle into the consciousness of soldiers who have known nothing but movement and offensive action for months? Gradually, perhaps, through the accumulation of small details, the rhythm of work details replacing the rhythm of marches, the way guards rotated through static positions, the growing sense that the next order might be to hold, not to advance. By November, the transformation was complete. Army Group North was no longer an army of invasion. It had become an army of siege, and the long, terrible winter was about to teach both attackers and defenders what such a posture truly meant. The woods around Leningrad began to fill with smoke from fires, improvised shelters, and the austere preparations of men settling in for months of cold and hunger, a settling in that would define the next 2.5 years. This is stretch 20, middle of a longer arc, so no opening hook needed, no subscribe invitation, no calls to action. Tone, reflective, warm, sorrow-tinged but never melodramatic. Focus, human cost by end of 1941, wounded, missing, civilians in the crossfire. Avoid, lecturing, graphic violence, modern moral language. Include personal details, letters, rations, small moments, statistics tempered with human texture, the fog of war, evacuation stories, medical overwhelm. Pacing, slow, breath-like, occasional gentle questions to the listener. Length target, 7,143 characters, roughly 950 to 1050 words at natural sleep-dock pace. Seamless flow, assume listener already knows the campaign arc to this point. Continue the immersion. By the closing months of 1941, as the first snow began to fall across the forests north of Moscow and the Wehrmacht's supply lines grew ever more tenuous, a different kind of reckoning had begun. Not in the reports sent westward to Berlin, where strategic assessments and casualty figures were passed by staff officers in heated rooms, but in the quieter spaces of field hospitals and railway sidings, in the growing lists of missing soldiers posted on parish walls in small towns across Germany and Sweden, and in the silence of villages whose populations had simply vanished in the tide of war. By December, the human cost of the drive to Leningrad had become visible in ways that statistics alone could never capture. The wounded filled every available space along Army Group North's supply routes. Field hospitals, hastily established in captured schools and Soviet barracks, were overwhelmed within weeks of the invasion's opening. Surgical teams worked without sleep, their hands trembling not from exhaustion alone, but from the sheer volume of need and the growing scarcity of supplies. The roads south toward the Reich were crowded with ambulance convoys, and yet somehow there were always more men arriving, their uniforms stained with blood and mud, their eyes holding a particular kind of confusion that comes from injury far from home. German military doctors kept meticulous records, and those records speak to a machinery of care stretched beyond its capacity. Infections claimed men who might have survived with proper dressings and antibiotics. Gangrene claimed fingers and hands and sometimes entire limbs. In some cases, the surgeon's records simply note death from sepsis, from blood poisoning born of wounds that, in a different war or a different time, would have been survivable. The missing were perhaps harder to account for. In the rapid advances of summer, when panzer columns moved so quickly that infantry couldn't keep pace, men became separated from their units. Some were captured, some simply disappeared into the forests and marshes of Lithuania and Latvia, disoriented, wounded, unable to find their way back to German lines. The casualty offices that began to open across northern Europe in the autumn of 1941 were inundated with inquiries from mothers and wives, letters written in careful handwriting on thin paper, asking if there was any word, any news at all. The replies, when they came, were often the same: missing in action, presumed dead, status unknown. Uncertainty became its own kind of wound, one that didn't stop bleeding when the fighting ended. Among the Soviet soldiers, the picture was grimmer still. The initial Soviet collapse in the Baltic region had meant that vast numbers of men were encircled and captured in the opening weeks. Hundreds of thousands of Red Army prisoners moved westward in long columns, inadequately fed, inadequately sheltered, subject to a German army that followed Hitler's orders regarding their treatment with a meticulousness that speaks to something darker than mere military pragmatism. Soviet prisoners in German camps during that first winter faced mortality rates that appalled even some German officers. Disease spread rapidly. Starvation was not accidental, but rather the logical extension of policy. By the end of 1941, the Soviet prisoners of war, in German hands, were dying at a rate measured in thousands per week. This too was part of the human cost, though it was a cost that German official records often preferred not to dwell upon. But perhaps the most profound displacement was that of the civilian populations caught in the collision of armies. The Baltic states, Lithuania and Latvia particularly, had been inhabited for centuries by populations whose lives suddenly became contingent on borders drawn by distant powers. As the German army advanced, Soviet evacuation orders went out hastily, sometimes creating chaos. People with connections to the Soviet apparatus fled eastward, clutching what they could carry. Others remained, uncertain whether it was safer to flee or to stay. The German army, following the campaign, brought with it not merely military administration, but a vast apparatus of ideology. Jews in the Baltics faced particular terror. Mobile killing units, Einsatzgruppen, followed behind the front lines, and by the close of 1941, entire Jewish communities that had existed for centuries in cities like Vilna and Riga had been reduced to fragments or erased entirely. The civilian refugees moved in both directions, creating a human landscape of almost incomprehensible complexity. Some fled eastward before the German advance, crowding into trains and onto roads, heading toward Moscow and beyond, hoping to outrun the war itself. Others moved westward or simply stayed, waiting to see what the new order would bring. The roads themselves became scenes of minor tragedies. A woman, separated from her children in a refugee column, an old man who could not keep pace and was left behind. A village burned for reasons that seemed to shift, depending on who was telling the story. The scale was too vast for individual stories, and yet each person involved lived through precisely one story, their own, which felt infinite to them. The physical landscape bore the scars of this passage. Burned-out villages dotted the maps from the Neman River to the approaches of Leningrad. Some were destroyed in combat. Others were systematically burned, either as reprisals or as part of a deliberate policy of denying resources to the enemy. The forests that had seemed so enduring, so permanent in the consciousness of people who had lived there for generations, were suddenly scarred with tank tracks and crater lines. Monuments that had stood for centuries were gone. In some cases, entire parishes of people simply ceased to exist as coherent communities. Families were scattered. Children were orphaned in numbers that local relief organizations couldn't track, let alone care for. By December 1941, as the first siege winter descended on Leningrad and the German lines solidified into something resembling a permanent defensive posture, the cost of the drive to Leningrad had become clear in microcosm. For every kilometer of territory gained by the Wehrmacht, a comparable volume of human suffering had been purchased. The soldiers understood this perhaps in the letters they wrote home. The tone of these letters changed over the course of the campaign. The initial exuberance, the sense of participating in an unstoppable offensive, gave way to something more muted. Men wrote of the cold, the monotony, the weight of their equipment. They wrote of comrades who had been killed or captured. They asked for news of home, for photographs, for any sign that another world existed beyond the frozen forests. Some wrote with a kind of fatalism that suggests they understood, at some level, that they were part of a machinery that would demand far more than anyone had initially imagined. And so the armies fell into a long, uneasy stillness. The great mechanical drive that had churned through forests and across rivers, that had covered hundreds of miles in a matter of weeks, came to rest against the city's outer defenses, like a wave exhausting itself upon stone. The panzer columns that had seemed invincible in open country found themselves grinding to a halt before defensive lines that would not shatter, before swamps that would not drain, before the simple, grinding reality of attrition that no amount of speed could overcome. The dream of a swift collapse, of reaching Leningrad before the autumn rains turned the roads to mud and the nights to something unbearable, had faded into the cold certainty of a siege. What must it have felt like for those officers and men standing in the frosted grass to understand that the war they thought they were fighting, the war of breakthrough and encirclement, of lightning victories and rapid retreat by the enemy, was not the war they would actually wage. For months, they had been the hunters. Now, in the waning light of 1941, the roles had subtly begun to shift. They remained in occupation of far greater territory than any army in Europe had held. They still held the initiative in most places along the Eastern Front, and yet something essential had changed. The certainty had evaporated. The calculations had grown uncertain. Behind the German lines, Army Group North settled into what might be called a holding pattern. Not quite victory, not yet defeat, but something far more ambiguous. The soldiers dug in. Trenches were deepened and reinforced as the earth hardened with the approach of winter. Supply lines, stretched to their limit and then beyond, continued to deliver what they could, when they could. Men who had marched in summer uniforms now wrapped themselves in whatever fabric they could find, for the clothing that had seemed adequate in June was rapidly proving catastrophically inadequate for a Russian winter that was already making itself felt in the nights. Food grew scarcer. Ammunition, while sufficient for the moment, could not be resupplied with the abundance they had known. Letters sent westward carried an undertone of exhaustion, a weariness that went deeper than the mere physical fatigue of campaign. The great surge of confidence that had propelled the invasion forward had curdled into something more complex, determination mixed with doubt, resilience shadowed by the first tremors of anxiety about what came next. Within Leningrad, a different kind of stillness was settling over the city. The evacuation across Lake Ladoga had slowed as the waters began to freeze. The circle drawn around the city was not yet complete. It would not be, truly, until February of the following year, but its margins were tightening with each passing day. The people of the city, who had worked through the summer to prepare its defenses, now faced the prospect of winter under partial siege. They did not yet know, because no one could know, what that winter would cost them. They did not know the hunger that would come, hunger so profound that it would transform human beings into something other than themselves, hunger that would blur the line between survival and surrender until it became almost invisible. But they sensed it. Something in the quality of the air had changed. The sounds of construction and mobilization had given way to something quieter, something more interior. The sound of a city preparing not for victory, but for endurance. And so the two great forces, the German armies pressing inward with dimming prospects of a decisive breakthrough, and the Soviet defenders digging deeper into the earth and the streets, had locked themselves into an embrace that neither could break and neither could escape. It was not yet the siege that history would remember. That would come in the months and years ahead, when the consequences of this moment of stalemate would reveal themselves in ways no one standing in that autumn light could have predicted, but the foundation had been laid. The trap had been set, though it remained unclear whether it was the hunter or the hunted who had constructed it. The drive to Leningrad had reached its limit. It had accomplished much, hundreds of miles of conquest, the destruction of multiple Soviet armies, the isolation of a great city from the world beyond. And yet it had accomplished nothing final. It had not brought victory. It had not broken Soviet resistance.